In the winter of 1066, just weeks after the Battle of Stamford Bridge had claimed the life of the great Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, a small group of surviving Norse warriors found themselves stranded on the Yorkshire coast. Their ships were battered, their leader was dead, and the English winter was closing, in around them like a fist. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, these men, numbering perhaps 24, took shelter in a ruined farmstead near Holderness and waited for the sea to calm. They waited for weeks. The locals, still raw from the invasion, refused them food or fire, and yet when spring finally crept over the horizon, every single one of those Norse survivors walked out alive. They had done what their ancestors had done for centuries. They had outlasted the darkness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love reading those. Someone last week was tuning in from Tromsø at 2 in the morning, which felt appropriate given what we were about to discuss. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Because tonight, you and I are going to do something a little different. We are not visiting a single moment in history. We are going to live through an entire season. Specifically, we are going to experience what it was like to survive a full Scandinavian winter during the Viking Age, roughly between the 8th and 11th centuries. We're talking about a world where, depending on how far north you lived, the sun might not rise above the horizon for weeks or even months at a time. A world where temperatures could plunge to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. A world where your survival depended entirely on what you had done in the months before the darkness arrived, and on the strength of the community huddled around you in the flickering glow of a single longhouse fire. You're a Norse farmer. Let us say you live somewhere along the western coast of Norway, perhaps near the Lofoten Islands, that jagged archipelago that juts out into the Norwegian Sea like the spine of some sleeping giant. It is late October by our modern reckoning, though you would not call it that. You would call this the month of Gormanuda, the slaughter month, and the name tells you everything you need to know about what is coming. The last of the autumn light is draining from the sky like water from a cracked vessel. Each day the sun climbs a little less enthusiastically above the southern mountains, hangs there for a few grudging hours, and then retreats. Soon it will not bother coming at all. You have been preparing for this moment since midsummer. Every Norse family has. Because in this world, winter is not an inconvenience. It is not something you complain about while waiting for your car to warm up. Winter is the great test. It is the season that separates the living from the dead, the prepared from the desperate. And the Vikings, whatever else you might think of them, were extraordinarily good at passing this test. Historians still argue whether the Norse were uniquely adapted to cold, survival, or whether they simply inherited techniques from earlier Scandinavian peoples stretching back to the Iron Age and beyond. The truth is probably a generous helping of both. What we do know from archaeological excavations at sites like Borg in the Lofoten Islands, Kappang in southern Norway, and Hedeby in what is now northern Germany, is that the Vikings developed an intricate and deeply practical system for surviving the darkest months on Earth. So let us begin. You're standing outside your longhouse. The wind is picking up from the northwest, carrying with it the sharp smell of salt and the promise of snow. Your breath hangs in the air like a small ghost. Behind you, through the low doorway, you can hear the sounds of your household settling in for the evening. The clatter of wooden bowls, the murmur of voices, the occasional bleat of a goat that has already been brought inside for the season. You pull your woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders, take one last look at the darkening sky, and step inside. Welcome to the long night. The first thing you need to understand about Scandinavian winter is the darkness itself. We throw that word around casually in the modern world, darkness, as though it simply means the absence of overhead lighting. But in Viking Age Norway, darkness was a physical presence. It was a weight that settled over the landscape and pressed down on everything. The fjords, the mountains, the scattered farmsteads clinging to the coastline like barnacles on a ship's hull. In the Lofoten Islands, which sit above the Arctic Circle at roughly 68 degrees north latitude, the phenomenon known as Mårketid, the murky time, begins in late November. The sun dips below the horizon and simply does not return. For nearly 2 months, from late November to late January, there is no sunrise. The sky offers only a few hours of deep twilight around midday, a bruised blue glow that creeps along the southern horizon before retreating again. The rest is darkness. Pure, relentless, suffocating darkness. Further south, in places like Trondheim or Bergen, you would get a few hours of pale winter daylight. But even there, The sun barely clears the mountaintops. It slides along at such a low angle that the light feels more like a rumour than a reality. The shadows are longer than the things casting them, and by 3 in the afternoon it is dark again. Now imagine experiencing this without electric lights, without street lamps, without the warm glow of a screen to distract you. Your entire world contracts to the space illuminated by fire and oil lamps, and beyond that circle of warmth and light, there is nothing but cold and black and the sound of wind. This is what the Norse called the Fimbulvetter in their mythology, though that term specifically referred to the terrible winter that would precede Ragnarok, the end of the world. But you can see how ordinary Scandinavian winters might have inspired that apocalyptic imagery. When you live through months of darkness and cold so intense that the sea itself can freeze in the fjords, the end of the world does not seem like such a stretch of the imagination. The temperature during a Norwegian winter varied, dramatically depending on location and elevation, but inland areas regularly experienced temperatures of -20 to -30 degrees Celsius. Coastal regions, warmed somewhat by the North Atlantic Current, that great river of relatively warm water flowing up from the Gulf of Mexico, were milder but wetter. The Lofoten Islands, despite their extreme northern location, rarely dropped below -10 or 15 Celsius, thanks to that oceanic influence. But the wind made everything worse. Arctic gales could drive the wind chill to bone-cracking levels, and storms could last for days, turning the world into a howling white blur. Here is a quirky detail that historians love to debate. The Vikings had no standardized system for measuring temperature, obviously, but they did have an elaborate vocabulary for different types of cold. There were distinct Old Norse words for the kind of cold that makes your fingers ache, the kind that makes your eyelashes freeze together, and the kind that settles into your joints like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. They had words for frost that forms on the inside of walls and frost that forms on beards. They were, in a sense, connoisseurs of cold. The psychological impact of the darkness should not be underestimated either. Modern research into seasonal affective disorder has shown that prolonged darkness can cause depression, lethargy, disrupted sleep patterns, and a host of other problems. The Vikings would not have had clinical language for these experiences, but they certainly knew about them. The sagas occasionally reference people becoming strange or withdrawn during the winter months. There are accounts of individuals who simply stopped eating or speaking, who sat by the fire and stared at nothing for days on end. The Norse had their own way of understanding this darkness. It was not merely the absence of the sun, it was the domain of specific forces and beings. In Norse cosmology, the giantess Skadi, associated with winter, mountains and skiing, ruled over the cold months. The great wolf Skoll chased the sun across the sky, and in winter it seemed as though the wolf was winning. The darkness was alive. It had agency. It was something you survived, not something you simply waited out. And survive they did. The Viking approach to winter was not passive endurance. It was active, organised, and communal. Every member of the household had a role. Every task served a purpose. The long night was not empty time to be filled. It was a season with its own rhythms, its own rituals, and its own strange, smoky, firelit beauty. But before we can settle into the longhouse for winter, we need to understand the longhouse itself, because that building, more than any weapon or ship, was the Vikings' greatest survival tool. The longhouse. If the Viking longship was the tool that carried the Norse across the world, the longhouse was the tool that kept them alive at home. And standing here at the threshold of yours, you can appreciate why. Your longhouse is not a pretty building. No one is going to paint a watercolour of it and hang it in a gallery. It is a long, low, slightly curved structure, roughly 30 metres from end to end, maybe 6 or 7 metres wide. The walls are made of timber frames packed with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks plastered with mud, clay and animal dung. In some regions, particularly in Iceland and the Faroe Islands where timber was scarce, the walls would be made almost entirely of turf, thick blocks of earth and grass stacked like enormous bricks. Your longhouse, being on the Norwegian coast where timber is available, uses a combination of both. The lower walls are stone, the upper walls are timber, and the whole thing is covered with a thick layer of turf that makes the building look like a small hill with a door. The roof is the most important part. It is steeply pitched to shed snow because a flat roof in Norway would collapse under the weight of the first serious snowfall. The roofing material is birch bark layered over wooden planks, with more turf on top. It is not waterproof in the modern sense, and during heavy rain or rapid snowmelt, you will get drips. But it is remarkably effective insulation. archaeological experiments at the reconstructed longhouse at Borg in the Lofoten Islands, built on the site of the largest Viking longhouse ever discovered, an astonishing 83 metres long, have shown that the combination of timber, turf, and the natural air gap between layers can keep the interior temperature remarkably stable, even when the outside temperature plunges well below freezing. Inside, the longhouse is organised along a central axis. Running down the middle of the building is a long narrow hearth, a line of fire that serves as the building's heart in every sense of the word. The fire is everything. It provides heat, light, a place to cook, and a focal point for the entire household. The smoke rises to the roof, where it drifts out through a small opening or louvre at the ridge. This smoke hole is adjustable, a clever bit of engineering, because you need to balance ventilation against heat loss. Too much opening and the cold pours in. Too little and the smoke builds up until everyone is coughing and weeping. On either side of the central hearth, raised platforms run the length of the building. These are the benches. During the day, they serve as workspaces and seating. At night, people sleep on them, bundled in furs and woolen blankets. The raised position keeps sleepers above the coldest air, which naturally sinks to floor level. It is a simple but effective piece of thermal engineering that the Norse figured out centuries before anyone had a theory of convection. At one end of the longhouse is the byre, the animal section. During winter, your livestock lives with you. Cattle, goats, sheep, and sometimes horses are brought inside and housed in stalls at the far end of the building. This might sound unpleasant, and it certainly added to the overall aroma of the place, but it served a critical purpose. Each cow generates roughly the same amount of heat as a small space heater. A dozen cattle in the byre end of your longhouse are essentially a biological heating system, radiating warmth that drifts through the building all night long. The animals also need to be protected from the cold, of course, so the arrangement benefits everyone. The other end of the longhouse is the high seat area, the social and ceremonial centre of the household. This is where the head of the family sits, where guests are received, and where the most important conversations happen. The high seat is flanked by elaborately carved wooden pillars, and the walls behind it might be hung with woven tapestries, depicting scenes from mythology or family history. During the excavation at Borg, archaeologists discovered fragments of what appeared to be gold leaf decorations and imported glass, suggesting that even in this remote northern outpost, the longhouse of a wealthy chieftain could be surprisingly luxurious. Historians still argue whether the average Viking longhouse was genuinely comfortable by any reasonable standard, or whether we have romanticised these buildings based on the finest examples. The truth is that comfort is relative. By the standards of 9th century northern Europe, a well-built longhouse with a good fire, a full larder, and animals in the byre was an excellent place to be. By modern standards, it would be dark, smoky, crowded, and permeated with the smell of livestock, cooking food, wet wool, and unwashed bodies. But there is a certain coziness to it as well. The firelight plays across the wooden beams above your head. The embers glow red in the central hearth. The sounds of a household settling in for the night, the murmur of conversation, the soft thud of a loom weight, the contented sighing of cattle create a kind of warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. You find your place on the bench. Someone hands you a bowl of something warm. The fire crackles. Outside the wind howls. Inside you're safe, for now. But safety in a Viking winter was never guaranteed. It was earned painstakingly over the preceding months. And if we're going to understand how you survived the long night, we need to rewind slightly, back to the frantic weeks of autumn preparation that made winter survival possible. The Viking year was divided not into our modern 4 seasons, but into 2 fundamental halves, summer and winter, with the transition points marked by specific dates and festivals. Winter officially began at the Feast of Vetraneta, the Winter Nights, which fell around mid-October. But the real preparation started much earlier, in the golden weeks of late summer and early autumn, when the days were still long enough to work from dawn to dusk and the urgency of the coming darkness drove every member of the household to action. Let us start with the harvest. You and your family have been working the fields since spring, coaxing barley, oats, and rye from the thin Scandinavian soil. In the Lofoten Islands, where you live, the growing season is brutally short. The midnight sun of midsummer gives you almost 24 hours of light for growing, which helps, but the cool temperatures and unpredictable weather mean that every grain is precious. You harvest by hand, cutting the stalks with iron sickles, binding them into sheaves, and stacking them to dry before threshing. The grain is then stored in wooden bins inside the longhouse or in separate outbuildings. But grain alone will not keep. You are alive through a 6-month winter. You need protein and lots of it. This is where the sea comes in. The waters around the Lofoten Islands are extraordinarily rich in fish, particularly cod. The great annual cod migration brings millions of Arctic cod, known as scree, swimming south from the Barents Sea to spawn in the relatively warm waters around Lofoten. This migration has been happening for thousands of years, and it made the Lofoten Islands one of the most important fishing grounds in the entire North Atlantic. During autumn, you and every able-bodied member of your community have been fishing relentlessly. You go out in small boats, open vessels not much bigger than a modern rowboat, and haul in cod by the hundreds. The fish are gutted, tied in pairs by their tails, and hung on large wooden drying racks called yell. These racks are everywhere along the coast. Forests of wooden frames festooned with thousands of pale fish carcasses swaying in the wind. The fish dry slowly in the cold, clean air, losing roughly 80% of their moisture over the course of several months. The result is stockfish, turfisk in Norwegian, one of the most remarkable preserved foods in human history. A properly dried stockfish can last for years. It is light enough to transport in enormous quantities, nutritionally dense, and once rehydrated by soaking in water for several days, perfectly edible. The Vikings took stockfish with them on their voyages across the Atlantic, to Iceland, to Greenland, and possibly even to Vinland, what we now call North America. DNA analysis of cod bones found at the Viking trading settlement at Heithabu, modern Hedeby in northern Germany, confirmed that the fish came from the waters around northern Norway, proving that the stockfish trade was already well established by the 9th or 10th century. Here is a quirky tidbit that might make you smile. The word stockfish has nothing to do with financial stock or livestock. It comes from the Old Norse word stockfiska, where stock means stick or log. Stockfish is stickfish, named for the wooden racks on which it was dried. Though after several months of drying, the fish itself becomes about as hard and flexible as a stick, so the name works on multiple levels. Beyond cod, you are also preserving herring by salting and smoking, catching and drying freshwater fish from rivers and lakes, and hunting seals when the opportunity arises. Seal meat and blubber are particularly valuable, as the fat provides concentrated calories and can also be burned in oil lamps. Everything that can be caught is caught. Everything that can be preserved is preserved. There is no such thing as waste in a Viking autumn. And then there is the matter of the animals. As autumn deepens and the grass stops growing, a difficult calculation must be made. How many animals can you feed through the winter? Hay has been cut and stored, great stacks of it piled in barns and outbuildings, but there is only so much. You have been gathering it since July, cutting the wild grasses of the meadows with long-handled scythes and raking it into piles to dry. But the hay supply is finite, and every cow, every goat, every sheep that you keep alive through winter is one more mouth to feed from your carefully hoarded reserves. This brings us to the event that gives the month its name, Gormanuda, the slaughter month. The slaughter is not a celebration exactly, but neither is it a grim affair. It is a practical necessity wrapped in ritual and seasoned, with a kind of solemn gratitude. You're about to kill a significant portion of your livestock, and the Norse, for all their reputation as fierce warriors, had a deep respect for the animals that sustained them. The decision of which animals to keep and which to slaughter is made carefully. Your best breeding stock, the strongest bull, the healthiest cows, the ewes that produce the most milk, these are spared. They will be fed through the winter on your precious hay reserves and will form the foundation of next year's herds. The rest, the older animals, the weaker ones, the males that are surplus to breeding requirements, these are marked for slaughter. The killing is done quickly and efficiently. The Norse used a combination of poleaxes and knives, and an experienced farmer could dispatch an animal in seconds. The sagas mention the practice of blot, ritual sacrifice, in connection with autumn slaughter, and it is likely that at least some of the animals were killed with a degree of ceremony, their blood collected in bowls and sprinkled on the walls of the longhouse, on the carved idols of the gods, and even on the assembled household members. This was not gore for its own sake. It was a transaction with the divine, an offering of life in exchange for protection through the coming darkness. But most of the slaughter was purely practical, and the real work began after the killing. Every part of every animal had to be processed and quickly before the meat could spoil. This was a whole community effort, a controlled frenzy of butchering, salting, smoking and storing that could last for days. The meat was preserved in several ways. The primary method was salting. Salt was a precious commodity in Viking Scandinavia. obtained either by boiling seawater, a tedious and fuel-intensive process, or by trade. Norse traders brought salt from the continent, from places like Lüneburg in northern Germany, where vast salt deposits had been mined since Roman times. The meat was rubbed with coarse salt and packed tightly in wooden barrels or stone-lined storage pits. Properly salted meat could last for months. Smoking was another crucial preservation technique. A separate smokehouse, or sometimes just a section of the longhouse where smoke from the central fire was channeled, was used to slowly cure joints of meat, sausages, and fish. The smoke served a dual purpose. It dried the meat and it deposited chemicals, primarily formaldehyde and acetic acid, that inhibited bacterial growth. Smoked meat had a distinctive flavour that the Norse clearly enjoyed. Smoked preparations feature prominently in descriptions of feasts. Then there was fermentation. The Norse were enthusiastic fermenters. They fermented fish in buried pits to create a pungent, protein-rich food that modern Scandinavians still eat as hakal in Iceland and rakfisk in Norway. They fermented dairy products to create skyr, a thick yogurt-like substance that was a winter staple. They fermented cabbage and other vegetables in ways similar to modern sauerkraut. Fermentation was not just preservation, it was transformation. The process broke down complex proteins and created new nutrients, including certain vitamins that were otherwise hard to obtain in a northern winter diet. Historians still argue whether the Vikings intentionally understood the nutritional benefits of fermentation or whether they simply noticed that people who ate fermented foods tended to stay healthier. Either way, the result was the same. A Norse household entering winter with a good supply of fermented foods was significantly less likely to suffer from the nutritional deficiencies that plagued other medieval populations during the cold months. The blood from the slaughtered animals was not wasted either. It was mixed with grain, fat, and herbs to make blood sausage, a dense, calorie-rich food that stored well and provided iron and other minerals. The intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings. The hides were scraped, stretched, and treated for leather. The bones were saved for making tools, needles, ice skates, and gaming pieces. The tallow, rendered animal fat, was collected and stored for use in cooking, and, crucially, for fueling oil lamps during the dark months ahead. Even the stomachs and bladders had uses. Inflated and dried, they could serve as containers for storing liquids or as floats for fishing nets. The horns were carved into drinking vessels, combs, and decorative objects. In the Viking world, an animal was not simply a source of meat. It was a kit of raw materials, and a good household used every single piece. By the time the slaughter was complete and all the meat had been processed, your longhouse and its outbuildings would be stocked with enough food to feed your household for months. Barrels of salted meat lined the walls. Strings of smoked sausages hung from the rafters. Stockfish was stacked like cordwood. Sealed pots of skyr and fermented vegetables sat in the cool storage areas. Bins of grain waited to be ground into flour. It was a fortress of food, and its walls were all that stood between you and starvation. You take a deep breath. The air inside the longhouse smells of smoke and salt and animal fat. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is the smell of survival. Now let us close the door and settle in. The darkness is here. The door of the longhouse is not just a door. It is a statement of intent. When you pull it shut against the November wind, you are sealing your household into a self-contained world that will sustain you for the next several months. The door itself is heavy, made of thick oak planks bound with iron, and it fits snugly into its frame. Some longhouses had a small vestibule or porch area, a kind of airlock that prevented the worst of the cold from rushing in every time someone entered or exited. You stomp the snow off your leather boots, hang your wet outer cloak on a peg, and step into the main hall. The warmth hits you like a wall. After the bitter cold outside, the interior of the longhouse feels almost tropical, though in reality it's probably only around 15 to 18 degrees Celsius near the fire, dropping to perhaps 5 or 6 degrees at the far ends of the building. The heat comes primarily from the central hearth, that long, narrow fire pit that runs down the middle of the hall. The fire is never allowed to go out. Maintaining it is one of the most important tasks in the household, typically assigned to the youngest able-bodied members of the family, who take turns through the night adding fuel and adjusting the flames. The fuel itself is a carefully managed resource. In the forested regions of Norway, firewood was relatively abundant, though gathering and chopping enough to last an entire winter was an enormous undertaking. A Norse household might burn through several cords of wood per month during the coldest periods. The preferred fuel was birch, which burns hot and relatively clean, followed by pine and spruce. In the treeless regions of Iceland and the Faroe Islands, where wood was scarce, the Norse burned peat, dried animal dung, and even bone. Driftwood, carried by ocean currents from the forests of Siberia and North America, was collected from beaches and hoarded like treasure. Here is an interesting detail. Archaeological evidence from several Norse sites suggests that the Vikings practiced a form of woodland management, selectively cutting trees and allowing forests to regenerate rather than simply clear-cutting everything in sight. Whether this was conscious conservation or simply practical necessity is debated, but the result was that many Norwegian coastal communities maintained sustainable fuel supplies for generations. The fire in the longhouse hearth was not just a source of warmth and light. It was the centre of domestic life in a way that is difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. Cooking was done over the central fire using iron cauldrons suspended from chains above the flames, or on flat stones placed at the edge of the hearth. Bread was baked on griddles, stews simmered for hours, filling the longhouse with savoury steam. The fire dried wet clothing, warmed cold hands, and provided the light by which all evening activities took place. But the central hearth alone was not enough to illuminate a building 30 metres long. This is where the oil lamps came in. Viking oil lamps were simple but effective devices, typically made from soapstone, a soft, heat-resistant rock that was abundant in certain parts of Norway. The lamps were shallow bowls with a lip or channel for the wick, which was made from twisted moss, plant fibres, or cloth. The fuel was animal fat, usually tallow or fish oil, particularly cod liver oil, which burned with a steady, if somewhat smelly flame. Archaeological excavations at Byre in Sweden, one of the most important Viking-age trading towns, uncovered numerous soapstone lamps, suggesting that they were in widespread use across the Norse world. The lamps gave off a warm, golden light, much softer than modern electric lighting, and they cast long shadows that danced across the walls and ceiling beams. It must have been atmospheric, to say the least. Imagine spending your evening in a room lit only by fire and oil lamps, the shadows moving constantly, the faces around you half illuminated, half hidden. It would have felt like living inside a painting by Rembrandt. The smell, though. Let us be honest about the smell. A Viking longhouse in winter with its central fire, its oil lamps burning fish fat, its livestock at one end, its stores of salted meat and dried fish, its unwashed occupants wearing the same woolen garments day after day, must have had an aroma that would stagger a modern nose. The Norse were not dirty people by medieval standards. They actually bathed more frequently than many of their European contemporaries, but standards of hygiene were different. You bathed perhaps once a week, in a communal bathhouse if your community had one, using water heated with fire-warmed stones. Between baths, the longhouse accumulated its own distinctive perfume. Historians still argue whether the Vikings found their own living conditions uncomfortable, or whether, like humans everywhere, they simply adapted to what was normal for them. The evidence suggests the latter. There are very few complaints about domestic discomfort in the sagas. What bothered the Norse was not the smoke or the smell. It was the confinement. Being trapped inside by weather, unable to travel or work outdoors, was regarded as a genuine hardship, and the sagas are full of characters who grow restless, quarrelsome, or melancholy during extended periods of enforced inactivity, which is why the Vikings filled their winters with work. Let us talk about the women first, because in a Viking winter household, the women were doing the most essential and time-consuming work of all, and they were doing it in the most beautifully tedious way imaginable. You're sitting on the raised bench along the wall of the longhouse, and across the hall from you, in the best-lit area near the fire, 3 women are working at a loom. It is a warp-weighted loom, a wooden frame roughly 2 meters tall, leaning against the wall at a slight angle. Vertical threads, the warp, hang down from a horizontal beam at the top, weighted at the bottom by smooth stones, or clay discs that keep the threads taut. The women pass horizontal threads, the weft, back and forth through the warp using a wooden shuttle, gradually building up the fabric row by row. It is hypnotic to watch. The rhythmic clack of the loom weights as the warp threads are separated and recombined, the soft whisper of the shuttle passing through, the steady, patient accumulation of cloth, one thread at a time. Modern estimates suggest that weaving a single metre of standard woolen cloth on a warp-weighted loom took approximately 40 to 50 hours of work, and a Norse household needed dozens of metres of cloth each year, for clothing, for blankets, for sailcloth, for trade goods. This is why textile production was essentially a year-round activity. but it intensified dramatically during winter when outdoor work was impossible. The entire process, from raw wool to finished garment, was staggeringly labour-intensive. First, the wool had to be gathered. The Vikings did not shear their sheep as modern farmers do. Instead, they plucked the wool by hand during the spring molt, when the sheep naturally shed their fleece. This produced a different quality of fibre than shearing, with a natural tapered end that some scholars believe made for a superior yarn. The raw wool then had to be cleaned, a process involving washing and picking out debris, vegetable matter, and the inevitable sheep parasites. Then it was carded, pulled between two flat boards studded with wire teeth to align the fibres and prepare them for spinning. Spinning itself was done with a drop spindle, a weighted wooden shaft that the spinner set twirling while carefully feeding raw wool onto the forming thread. A skilled spinner could produce a remarkably even, strong yarn, but it was slow work. Some historians estimate that spinning enough yarn for a single garment took longer than the actual weaving. The women of a Viking household typically spent their winter evenings spinning. It was work that could be done by firelight, that did not require a dedicated workspace, and that could be interrupted and resumed at will. Spindle whorls, the small stone or clay weights that provided momentum for the drop spindle, are among the most common finds at Viking archaeological sites, which gives you some idea of just how much spinning was going on. Here is a quirky detail that historians love. In Old Norse, the word for the female side of a family was called the spindle side, spinulid, just as the male side was called the sword side. Spinning was so thoroughly associated with women that it became a metaphor for femininity itself. The goddess Frigg, wife of Odin, was often depicted with a spindle, and the act of spinning was linked to fate itself. With the Norns, the three supernatural women who controlled human destiny, described as spinning the threads of life. But the women of the longhouse were not only spinners and weavers, they were also nail-binders, practitioners of an ancient textile technique that predates knitting by thousands of years. Nail-binding, which translates roughly as needle-binding, uses a single large needle and short lengths of yarn to create a looped fabric that looks superficially similar to knitting, but is structurally quite different. The loops are interconnected in a way that makes the fabric incredibly durable and resistant to unravelling. If you cut a hole in a nail-binded garment, the damage stays local. It does not run or ladder the way a knitted fabric would. The Vikings used nail-binding to make socks, mittens and hats, the essential accessories for surviving a Scandinavian winter. Archaeological finds of nail-binded items from sites across the Norse world show a remarkable consistency of technique, suggesting that the skill was passed from mother to daughter across generations and across vast distances. A pair of nail-binded socks found in York, in northern England, uses essentially the same technique as socks found in Norway and Iceland, evidence of a shared textile tradition that travelled with the Norse wherever they went. While the women worked at their textiles, the men of the household were busy with their own winter crafts. Woodworking was perhaps the most important male winter occupation. The long, dark evenings were ideal for the kind of patient, detailed work that went into carving household objects, furniture, tools, and decorative items. You might spend an evening carving a new ladle for the kitchen, or a set of wooden plates, or a more ambitious project like a storage chest with interlocking joints and carved panels. The quality of Viking woodworking was extraordinary. The ship burials at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway preserved wooden objects of breathtaking craftsmanship, from the serpentine carvings on the ship's prow to the delicately carved sledges and furniture found inside. These were products of a culture that valued skill with wood the way other cultures valued skill with stone or precious metals, and much of that skill was honed during long winter evenings, when a man with a sharp knife and a piece of seasoned birch or oak had nothing but time. Here is another thing the men were doing during winter, and it is perhaps the most important winter task of all. They were repairing and maintaining ships. A Viking longship was not just a vehicle. It was the most valuable and technologically sophisticated object a Norse community possessed. Ships enabled trade, exploration, warfare, and communication. They were the lifeblood of Viking civilization, and like any complex piece of machinery, they required constant maintenance. During winter, ships were hauled ashore and stored in boat sheds called norsts. These were long, narrow buildings, open at one end, that protected the vessels from the worst of the weather while allowing access for repairs. The work of winter maintenance was extensive. Hulls had to be inspected for damage, planks replaced if cracked or rotted. The clinker-built construction of a Viking ship with overlapping planks riveted together meant that repairs could be made by removing and replacing individual planks without disassembling the entire hull. The seams between planks needed to be recaulked. The Norse used a mixture of animal hair, usually cow or horse hair, saturated with pine tar, pressed into the gaps between planks. Pine tar was a critical substance in the Viking world, used not only for ships but for waterproofing roofs, preserving rope, and treating leather. It was produced by slowly heating pine wood in a sealed pit or kiln, a process that extracted the thick, dark, aromatic resin. Archaeological excavations at Nestovo in Russia uncovered 10th century tar pits associated with Viking ship maintenance, suggesting that tar production was a widespread and well-organized industry. The rigging also needed attention. Ropes made from hemp, lime bast, or walrus hide had to be inspected, repaired, or replaced. Sails, made from woven wool treated with horse fat or fish oil to make them somewhat water-resistant, required patching and re-waterproofing. The mast step, the socket in the ship's keel that held the base of the mast, had to be checked for wear and reinforced if necessary. All of this work was done by firelight and lamplight, in boat sheds that were only marginally warmer than the outside air. It was cold, painstaking work, but it was essential. When spring came and the sea routes opened again, the ships had to be ready. A community that neglected its winter ship maintenance was a community that would fall behind its rivals in trade, in raiding, and in the complex network of alliances and obligations that bound the Norse world together. Now let us talk about something that might seem mundane but was actually a matter of life and death in a Viking winter. Let us talk about food. Not the autumn preparations we already discussed. Those are done. The barrels are sealed, the stockfish is stacked, the fermented foods are quietly bubbling in their sealed containers. What I want to talk about now is the daily reality of eating during the dark months, the rhythm and ritual of Viking winter meals. The Norse typically ate 2 meals a day. The first, called dagmal, literally day meal, was eaten in the morning, perhaps an hour or two after waking. The second, called natmal, night meal, was served in the evening, usually after the day's work was done. There might be snacking in between, but the formal meals were the anchors of the daily routine. A typical winter dagmal might consist of porridge, made from barley or oats cooked with water or whey, perhaps sweetened with a little honey if you were fortunate. Alongside this you might have flatbread, baked on a griddle over the fire, and a piece of dried fish or smoked meat. Butter, if you had managed to preserve enough from the summer dairy season, was a prized addition to both porridge and bread. You washed it down with ale, thin and slightly sour, brewed from barley and flavoured with whatever bittering herbs were available, including yarrow, sweet gale, and juniper berries. Hops were becoming more common by the later Viking age, but they were not yet universal. The natmal, the evening meal, was the more substantial of the two. This was when the iron cauldron came off its chain above the fire, filled with a thick stew that had been simmering for hours. The base was usually meat or fish, supplemented with whatever root vegetables had been stored, turnips, parsnips, and occasionally wild onions or garlic. Dried peas and beans added bulk and protein. The stew was seasoned with herbs. Cumin was surprisingly popular among the Norse, along with mustard seed, dill, and coriander. Salt was used sparingly, given its value, and the overall flavour profile was probably richer and more complex than you might expect. Bread was a constant presence at Viking meals, but it was not the soft, leavened loaves that modern Westerners think of. Viking bread was typically flat bread, unleavened or only slightly leavened, baked on flat stones or iron griddles. It was dense, chewy, and filling. Analysis of preserved bread fragments from Viking sites has revealed that the Norse sometimes added seeds, ground bark, and even dried blood to their bread dough, creating a product that was as nutritionally dense as possible. Dairy products played a crucial role in the winter diet, particularly skyr. Modern skyr, sold in supermarkets around the world, is a pale imitation of the Viking original, which was a thick, intensely tangy, fermented dairy product made by adding bacterial cultures to skimmed milk. It was eaten on its own, mixed with berries when available, or thinned with whey to make a refreshing drink. Skyr was one of the few sources of fresh protein available during winter, since the kept livestock were not producing much milk during the short, cold days. Here is a quirky tidbit about Viking nutrition that might surprise you. Despite the harsh conditions and limited variety of their winter diet, the Norse were, on average, remarkably well nourished compared to many other medieval European populations. Analysis of Viking age skeletal remains shows that the average Norseman stood about 5 feet, 7 to 5 feet 9 inches tall, which is only slightly shorter than the modern Scandinavian average, and significantly taller than many of their contemporary European peers. Their bones show signs of robust muscle development and relatively good dental health, at least until sugar became more available in the later medieval period. This nutritional success was largely due to the combination of preserved fish, fermented dairy, and the wide variety of wild foods that the Norse supplemented their diet with. Even in winter, it was possible to gather certain foods from the wild. Seabirds and their eggs were harvested from coastal cliffs. Seaweed was collected and dried. In milder periods, it was possible to dig for shellfish along the shore, and the Norse ate some things that modern diners might find adventurous, including whale meat and blubber when a whale was beached or hunted, seal meat, and even horse meat, at least until the Christian church began prohibiting it. The evening meal was also a social event, perhaps the most important social event of the day. The entire household ate together, seated on the benches along the walls of the longhouse, with the head of the family in the high seat. Food was served in wooden bowls and eaten with knives and spoons. Forks were not used. The Norse ate with their fingers for the most part, which was common across medieval Europe. Drinking horns and wooden cups were filled with ale, and conversation flowed freely. It was during these evening meals that the household caught up on the day's news, discussed plans, resolved disputes, and told stories. The fire crackled, the oil lamps flickered, the ale loosened tongues, and gradually the talk would shift from practical matters to something older and deeper. Someone would begin to tell a story. Storytelling was not entertainment in the Viking world, or rather, it was entertainment, but it was also education, history, law, religion, and therapy, all rolled into one. The oral tradition was the backbone of Norse culture, the method by which everything important was transmitted from generation to generation, and winter was storytelling season. You settled deeper into your furs on the bench, your belly warm with stew and ale, and you listen. Tonight the storyteller is an older man, a farmer from a neighbouring steading who's come to spend a few nights with your household. He is not a professional skald, not one of those famous court poets who composed elaborate verses for kings and jarls. He is an ordinary man with an extraordinary memory, and he knows the stories. He begins with a tale from the Poetic Edda, the great collection of mythological and heroic poems that formed the literary foundation of Norse culture. These poems were not written down during the Viking Age itself. That would come later, in the 12th and 13th centuries, when Icelandic scholars like Snorri Sturluson committed the oral traditions to parchment. But during the Viking Age, they lived in the mouths of storytellers like this man, passed from voice to ear to memory to voice again, an unbroken chain of words stretching back into the mists of prehistory. Tonight's tale is the Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, perhaps the most famous poem in all of Old Norse literature. It tells the story of the creation of the world, the golden age of the gods, the coming of evil, and the final battle of Ragnarok, when the gods and the giants will destroy each other and the world will end in fire and flood before being reborn anew. The storyteller's voice is low and rhythmic, rising and falling in the cadences of Old Norse verse. The Poetic Edda uses a meter called fornodislag, Old Story meter, with lines of 4 stressed syllables divided into 2 half-lines by a caesura. It is a meter designed for memorization and oral performance, and in the firelit longhouse, with the wind howling outside, it has an almost hypnotic power. You feel yourself drifting as the words wash over you, carried along by the current of the story. Skalds, the professional poets, occupied a uniquely elevated position in Norse society. A skilled skald was welcomed in any hall, from the poorest farmer's longhouse to the great mead halls of kings. In exchange for hospitality, the skald offered his art, composing praise poems for his hosts, reciting sagas of ancient heroes, and performing the intricate verbal acrobatics of skaldic verse. Skaldic poetry was fiendishly complex. It used a system of metaphors called kennings, compressed poetic expressions that described one thing in terms of another. The sea was the whale road. A sword was a wound serpent. Gold was the fire of the Rhine, referencing the legendary treasure of the Nibelungs. A ship was the horse of the waves. A warrior was a feeder of ravens. These kennings could be nested within each other, creating layers of meaning that rewarded the attentive listener and baffled the inattentive one. Historians still argue whether ordinary Vikings understood and appreciated the full complexity of skaldic verse, or whether it was an elite art form appreciated mainly by other skalds, and the nobles who patronized them. The evidence suggests that the Norse were by and large a remarkably literate culture, not in the sense of reading and writing, which was limited to runic inscriptions on stone and wood, but in the sense of verbal sophistication. Puns, wordplay, riddles, and elaborate metaphors were popular at all levels of society. The sagas record numerous instances of ordinary farmers and fishermen composing impromptu verses, suggesting that poetic skill was widely distributed. But it was not only mythology and poetry that filled the winter evenings. The sagas themselves, those long prose narratives that chronicle the lives and feuds of Icelandic families, were also told during winter gatherings. The saga of Grettir the Strong, perhaps the most vivid survival narrative in all of medieval literature, tells the story of a man outlawed by the Icelandic Althing, who survived for nearly 20 years in the wilderness, enduring winters that would have killed a lesser person. Grettir's saga specifically describes the agony of winter outlawry. Cut off from the warmth and companionship of the longhouse, denied the communal support system that was essential for winter survival, an outlaw had to fend for himself in conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Grettir survived by sheltering in caves, stealing food and fire from isolated farms, and through sheer, stubborn refusal to die. He eventually made his way to the island of Drangey off the northern coast of Iceland, where the steep cliffs provided natural fortification and the seabird colonies provided food. He survived there for 3 years before his enemies finally caught up with him. The story of Grettir was not just entertainment. It was a survival manual wrapped in narrative. It taught listeners about the dangers of isolation, the importance of community, and the techniques that could keep a person alive in the most extreme conditions. And it was told in winter, when those lessons were most relevant and most deeply felt. As the storyteller's voice fades and the fire settles into glowing embers, you find your eyelids growing heavy. The stories continue in a lower register, someone else picking up the thread with a tale of a local history, a boundary dispute settled by single combat, a fishing boat lost in a storm and miraculously recovered. The voices blend with the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the animals stirring in the byre. Sleep comes slowly in a Viking longhouse, settling over the household like a soft woolen blanket. But before you drift off entirely, let us talk about one more form of winter entertainment that kept the Norse sharp and occupied during the dark months. Let us talk about games. The Vikings were enthusiastic gamers, not in the modern sense, obviously, but they had a rich tradition of board games, dice games, and physical challenges that helped pass the long winter hours and that, not coincidentally, honed skills that were useful in the wider world. The most important Viking board game was Nefertafel, which translates roughly as fist table, or king's table. It was a strategy game played on a checkered board, typically 11 by 11 squares, though boards of other sizes have been found. The game was asymmetric. One player controlled a king and his small band of defenders, positioned in the centre of the board, while the other player commanded a larger force of attackers arranged around the edges. The king's objective was to escape to one of the corner squares. The attacker's objective was to capture the king by surrounding him on all 4 sides. If this sounds familiar, it should. Nefertafel is essentially a game of siege and escape, and it mirrors the strategic realities of Viking warfare and politics with remarkable precision. The defender must think about escape routes and diversions. The attacker must coordinate encirclement. Both players must anticipate their opponent's moves several steps ahead. It was, in every sense, a war game, and it was taken very seriously. Archaeological evidence of Nefertafel is abundant. Gaming boards have been found at sites across the Viking world, from Norway and Sweden to Iceland, Ireland, and even Greenland. Perhaps the most dramatic find was at Torksey in Lincolnshire, England, where archaeologists excavating the winter camp of the Viking Great Army in 872 to 873 CE discovered over 300 lead gaming pieces. These warriors, who had just conquered much of eastern England, were apparently spending their downtime playing board games. The Gokstad ship burial, one of the most famous Viking Age finds in Norway, contained a gaming board and gaming pieces among the grave goods, suggesting that Nefertafel was considered important enough to accompany the dead into the afterlife. The Orkneyinga saga specifically lists skill at Nefertafel as one of the accomplishments of Earl Rognvald Kali Kolsson, a 12th century Norse Earl of Orkney who clearly considered himself a Renaissance man before the Renaissance. According to the saga, Rognvald listed his 9 skills, including board games, runes, reading, smithwork, skiing, shooting, rowing, harp playing, and poetry. The fact that board games topped the list is telling. Beyond Nefertafel, the Vikings played dice games, usually with simple bone dice marked with dots or lines. Gambling was popular and sometimes problematic. The sagas contain numerous accounts of disputes that arose from dice games, suggesting that the Norse were enthusiastic but not always gracious losers. There are references to games of physical skill as well: wrestling, stone throwing, swimming contests in frigid water, which was apparently considered entertainment rather than torture, and a form of ball game that may have been similar to a rough version of field hockey. Ice skating was another popular winter pastime. The Vikings made ice skates from the long bones of cattle or horses, specifically the metatarsals, which were naturally flat and elongated. The bones were smoothed on the bottom surface, and holes were drilled at each end for leather thongs that tied the skate to the wearer's shoe. They were not skates in the modern sense. There were no blades. Instead, the smooth bone surface reduced friction against the ice, and the skater propelled himself forward using a long stick with an iron point, pushing against the ice like a gondolier pushing against the bottom of a Venetian canal. Bone skates have been found at Viking sites all across northern Europe. The Swedish History Museum in Stockholm has examples from Birka dating to the 9th century, and researchers Rune Edberg and Johnny Carlson analysed nearly 700 bone skates from Birka and Sigtuna alone. In York, England, 42 bone skates were found at the Viking Age levels of the Coppergate excavation. These skates were clearly in widespread use, and they served both practical and recreational purposes. On a frozen river or lake, bone skates were the fastest way to travel, and they also made for excellent sport. Here is a quirky detail. Experiments with replica bone skates have shown that while they are slower and less manoeuvrable than modern steel-bladed skates, they are surprisingly effective on smooth ice. An experienced skater using the push-pull technique can achieve speeds of 15 to 20 km per hour. Not bad for a technology based on cattle bones and leather straps. Skiing was even more important than skating, particularly for travel and hunting. The Norse were accomplished skiers, using long wooden skis made from pine or birch, with simple leather bindings. In Norse mythology, the god Ulla and the giantess Skadi were both associated with skiing, suggesting that the practice had deep cultural significance. Archaeological finds of skis from Scandinavian bogs date back thousands of years before the Viking Age, and by the 9th and 10th centuries, skiing was an essential winter skill for any Norse person living in a snowy region. But of all the winter activities, the one that perhaps best captures the Viking spirit is something we have not yet discussed. Something that turned the darkest, coldest, most miserable point of winter into a celebration of light and life and defiant joy. Let us talk about Yule. Now, you might assume that once winter descended and the seas froze and the mountain passes filled with snow, the Norse world went into complete hibernation, that every community was sealed off from every other community, isolated until spring. But that assumption would be wrong. Winter travel was difficult, dangerous, and uncomfortable, but it was not impossible, and the Norse were too restless, too ambitious, and too deeply enmeshed in networks of trade and obligation to simply sit still for 6 months. The primary mode of winter travel was skiing. We have already mentioned that the Norse were accomplished skiers, but it bears emphasizing just how important skiing was for winter communication and trade. The long, narrow wooden skis that the Norse used, some of which have been preserved in Scandinavian bogs and are thousands of years old, were not recreational equipment. They were essential transportation technology, the winter equivalent of the horse or the boat. On skis, a fit and experienced traveller could cover 20 to 30 kilometres per day, even in deep snow, following established routes marked by cairns and natural landmarks. There were also sledges, pulled by horses or dogs, or, in some cases, pushed by the traveller on skis. Sledges were used for transporting goods, heavy materials, and people who were unable to ski, the very young, the very old, or the sick. The beautiful carved sledges found in the Oseberg ship burial give us some idea of how elaborate these vehicles could be, at least for the wealthy. Ordinary sledges were simpler, just wooden platforms on runners, but they were effective. The frozen fjords and lakes provided another type of winter highway. Once the ice was thick enough to bear weight, which it usually was by December, people could travel directly across bodies of water that would require long detours. By land during the ice-free months. Bone ice skates, which we discussed earlier, were used for short-distance travel on ice, but for longer journeys, skis and sledges were preferred. Trade continued through the winter, albeit at a reduced pace. The Kaupang trading settlement in southern Norway, which archaeological evidence suggests was occupied year-round by at least some inhabitants, would have served as a hub for winter trade. Furs, which were at their thickest and most valuable during winter, were a major trade commodity. Beaver, fox, marten and ermine pelts were collected by hunters and trappers throughout the winter months and accumulated for sale at the spring markets. Walrus ivory, another high-value trade good, was also hunted during winter expeditions to the northern coasts. The fur trade connected the Norse world to a much larger network of commerce that extended across Europe and into the Islamic world. Viking traders travelling the river routes of Russia, the famous Varangian routes, carried Scandinavian furs to Constantinople and Baghdad, where they were exchanged for silver, silk, spices and other luxury goods. Some of this trade continued during winter, with goods moving along frozen rivers and overland routes. The Arab geographer Ibn Khordadbeh, writing in the 9th century, described Norse traders reaching the markets of the Abbasid Caliphate, and while most of this travel occurred during the warmer months, the planning, preparation and accumulation of trade goods happened during winter. The exchange of information was perhaps even more important than the exchange of goods. Travellers who arrived at your longhouse during winter brought news from distant communities, reports of events, deaths, births, feuds, and political developments that might affect your own family and interests. A winter visitor was not just a guest to be fed and housed. He or she was a living newspaper, a source of intelligence that could shape your decisions for months to come. Here is a quirky detail that connects Viking winter travel to a surprising modern legacy. The postal systems of medieval Scandinavia, which evolved during and after the Viking Age, relied on a network of farms along established travel routes where messengers could rest, eat, and change horses or skis. This system, known in Norway as the skistasjon, or station system, persisted in various forms for centuries and was the direct ancestor of the modern Scandinavian postal service. The next time you mail a letter in Norway, you are participating in a tradition that stretches back to Viking Age travellers skiing through the winter darkness with messages strapped to their backs. Hospitality was not optional in the Norse world. It was a sacred obligation, enforced by custom, law, and the practical realities of travel in a harsh environment. If a traveller arrived at your longhouse seeking shelter, you were expected to provide it, regardless of whether you knew the person, liked the person, or could easily spare the food and space. Refusing hospitality was one of the most serious social offences in Norse culture, a violation of the code of honour that could result in shame, ostracism, and worse. The Havamal, the Sayings of the High One, a collection of Old Norse wisdom poetry attributed to Odin himself, devotes extensive attention to the proper behaviour of hosts and guests. The guest should be greeted with warmth and offered food, drink, and a place by the fire. The host should not interrogate the guest or demand to know their business until the guest has been fed and rested. In return, the guest should be gracious, respectful of the household's resources, and willing to share news and stories. It was a system of reciprocal generosity that made winter travel possible, and that reinforced the social bonds holding Norse communities together. Yule, Jol in Old Norse. The word itself may come from an ancient Proto-Germanic root meaning wheel or revolution, referring to the turning of the year, the moment when the darkness reaches its deepest point and begins, almost imperceptibly, to retreat. Or it may come from a word meaning feast or sacrifice. Historians are divided, which is fitting for a festival that was itself a fusion of the practical and the sacred. Yule was the great midwinter festival of the Norse world, and it was the single most important event of the winter season. It began around the winter solstice, roughly December 21st or 22nd by our modern calendar, though the exact date varied by region and tradition. The celebration lasted for a minimum of 3 days and as many as 12, depending on the wealth and inclination of the host. For wealthy chieftains and kings, Yule was an opportunity to display their generosity, reinforce their alliances and demonstrate their piety. For ordinary farming families, it was a desperately needed break from the monotony and hardship of winter. The preparations for Yule began weeks in advance. The best food and drink that had been set aside during the autumn was brought out. Special Yule ale was brewed, stronger and richer than the everyday brew, made with extra malt and sometimes flavoured with honey and spices. A Yule log, a massive piece of oak, was selected, carved with protective runes, and set aside for burning during the festival. This log would be lit from a piece of the previous year's Yule log, carefully saved for the purpose, creating a chain of fire that symbolically connected one year to the next. The Yule sacrifice, or Yule blot, was the religious centrepiece of the festival. Animals were slaughtered, their blood collected in bowls and sprinkled on the altar stones, on the walls of the hall, and on the assembled worshippers. The meat was then cooked and served at the great feast. The most important sacrificial animal was the sonagolta, the Yule boar, a specially selected pig that was the centerpiece of the feast. Before the boar was sacrificed, members of the household would place their hands upon its bristles and swear solemn oaths. These oaths, made in the presence of the gods and the community, were considered absolutely binding. You might swear to undertake a voyage, to seek revenge for a wrong, to marry, or to perform some other significant act in the coming year. The Yule feast itself was extraordinary by the standards of daily Viking life. The table, or rather the long benches, groaned under the weight of roasted pork, beef, mutton, smoked fish, fresh bread, butter, cheese, and all manner of preserved foods that had been saved for this occasion. Mead flowed freely, that ancient honey wine that the Norse loved above all other drinks. The word mead comes from the Old Norse mjod, and it held a special place in Norse mythology. The mead of poetry, brewed from the blood of the wise Kveser, was said to grant the gift of eloquence and wisdom to anyone who drank it. During Yule, the boundary between the mythological and the real grew thin, and every cup of mead was a small echo of that divine draught. Historians still argue about the exact nature of Yule religious observances. The sources are sparse and often contradictory, filtered through the lens of later Christian writers who had their own reasons for portraying pagan rituals in particular ways. What seems clear is that Yule was fundamentally about propitiation and hope. The sacrifices were offerings to the gods, particularly Odin, Thor, and Freyr, asking for protection during the remaining winter months and for prosperity in the year to come. The feasting and drinking were not mere indulgence. They were acts of communal solidarity, reminders that even in the darkest time life was worth celebrating. There was also a strong element of ancestor worship during Yule. The Norse believed that the spirits of the dead were particularly active during midwinter. The concept of the wild hunt, a spectral cavalcade of ghostly riders led by Odin that thundered across the winter sky, was closely associated with the Yule season. People left food and ale outside their doors for the spirits of departed family members. It was a time when the veil between the living and the dead was thin, and the past pressed close against the present. And then there was the light. In a season defined by darkness, Yule was an explosion of light. Every fire in the hall was built up to roaring intensity. Extra oil lamps were lit. The Yule log blazed. For a few glorious days, the longhouse was bathed in more light than at any other time during the winter, and the warmth and brightness had a psychological effect that was probably even more important than its physical comfort. Yule said in the language of fire and food and fellowship that the darkness had not won, that humans could push back against the long night with warmth and generosity and stubborn, ridiculous joy. After the formal religious observances, the celebration took on a more relaxed character. There was music, mostly drums and simple stringed instruments. There was dancing. There was a great deal more drinking. Games were played, Nefertafel tournaments were held, wrestling matches were staged, and the schools performed their most elaborate compositions. Poetry competitions were particularly popular, with rival schools attempting to outdo each other in complexity and wit. There was also gift-giving, a practice that would eventually merge with Christian Christmas traditions as Scandinavia was slowly Christianized over the 10th and 11th centuries. The Norse valued generosity above almost all other virtues, and Yule was the primary occasion for demonstrating it. A generous host who provided a magnificent feast and distributed gifts to his guests enhanced his reputation and strengthened the bonds of loyalty and obligation that held Norse society together. A stingy host who skimped on the Yule feast risked social disaster. Here is a quirky detail that connects the Viking Yule to our modern Christmas in an unexpected way. The Yule goat, a figure made of straw that is still a popular Christmas decoration in Scandinavia, has its origins in Thor's chariot goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjosta. According to Norse mythology, Thor could slaughter these goats, eat their meat, and then resurrect them the next day by waving his hammer over their bones. It is a story of death and renewal that fits perfectly into the Yule theme of the dying year and the returning light. The straw Yule goat, which you can still buy in any Swedish Christmas market, is a direct descendant of those mythological animals, a small piece of the Viking world that survived 1,000 years of cultural change. The Yule celebration typically ended around the beginning of January, and its conclusion marked a psychological turning point in the winter season. The worst of the darkness was over. From now on, each day would be imperceptibly longer than the last. The sun was coming back. Not quickly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The wheel of the year was turning, but there were still months of winter to endure. and the household settled back into its routines with renewed purpose. Let us talk about the forge, because somewhere on your farmstead, possibly in a separate building near the longhouse, there is a smithy. And during winter, the smith is one of the busiest people in the community. The blacksmith held a special status in Norse society, somewhere between craftsman and magician. The mythological smith Volund, whose story is told in the Poetic Edda, was a figure of almost supernatural skill, capable of forging objects of impossible beauty and terrible power. The dwarves of Norse mythology, master smiths who created the gods' greatest treasures, including Thor's hammer Mjolnir, Odin's spear Gungnir, and Freyr's golden boar Gullinbursti, reflected the high regard in which smithcraft was held. Your community's smith spends the winter months working through a long list of tasks. There are tools to repair, ploughshares to sharpen, knives to forge, axe heads to replace. There are nails to make for the ship repairs happening in the Norse. There are cooking implements, hinges, chains, and all the myriad iron objects that a Norse household depended on. Iron was smelted locally from bog iron, a low-grade ore found in wetlands and bogs across Scandinavia. The smelting process was simple but effective, heating the ore in a charcoal-fueled furnace until the iron separated from the slag. The smithy in winter is a welcome place. The forge fire roars, sending waves of heat into the small building. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil provides a percussion accompaniment to the day. The smith works with practiced efficiency, heating iron in the forge until it glows cherry red, then shaping it on the anvil with quick, precise blows. Sparks fly with each strike, tiny orange stars that arc through the air and die on the earthen floor. But the smith is not only making practical objects, he's also creating something more personal. It is winter, and warriors are thinking about the coming raiding season. Swords need to be repaired or replaced. New spearheads need to be forged. Shield bosses need to be hammered out. The highest quality Viking swords were made using a technique called pattern welding, in which strips of iron with different carbon content were twisted together and forge welded, creating a blade with both flexibility and hardness. The resulting pattern on the blade, visible after polishing and etching with acid, resembled flowing water or a serpent's scales, which is why the Norse sometimes called their swords worm blades. Historians still argue about how widespread pattern welding was during the Viking Age, and whether the finest blades were made locally or imported from Frankish smiths in the Rhineland. Both scenarios are supported by evidence. Some of the best Viking swords bear Frankish makers' marks, suggesting they were made in the great workshops of the Carolingian Empire and traded or looted by the Norse. But Norse smiths were also capable of producing exceptional blades, and the romantic image of a warrior commissioning a personal sword from his local smith is supported by saga evidence. While the men worked at the forge and the women worked at the loom, children had their own winter occupations. Viking childhood was not the prolonged, sheltered experience that modern Western children enjoy. By the age of 7 or 8, a Norse child was expected to contribute meaningfully to the household. Boys learned to use tools, tend animals, fish, and fight. Girls learned spinning, weaving, cooking, and the management of household stores. Both sexes learned the stories and laws of their people, memorizing the genealogies, the legal codes, and the mythological narratives that formed the foundation of Norse identity. Winter was school season in the Viking world, not in the formal sense of a classroom with a teacher, but in the sense that the long, dark evenings provided ample time for the older generation to instruct the younger. A grandfather might teach his grandson the names of the stars and their significance for navigation. A grandmother might teach her granddaughter the properties of different herbs and their uses in medicine. A father might teach his son the proper way to judge the weather by reading the clouds, the wind, and the behaviour of birds. Here is a charming detail from the archaeological record. At numerous Viking sites, archaeologists have found miniature versions of adult tools, tiny swords, small spindle whorls, miniature axes, and child-sized looms. These were not toys in the modern sense. They were training tools, scaled-down versions of the equipment that children would use as adults. The existence of these objects tells us that the Vikings took the education of their children seriously, and that they understood the importance of learning by doing, starting with tools that small hands could manage. Children also played. Bone skates sized for children have been found at Birka and other sites. Wooden toys, including carved horses, boats and human figures, have been recovered from Viking Age contexts, and the sagas mention children playing games that involved running, wrestling and throwing, outdoor activities that continued even in winter, at least during the brief periods of twilight or clear weather. The household, then, was a kind of school, factory and community centre all in one. Everyone had tasks, everyone contributed, and the winter months, far from being a period of idle waiting, were filled with productive activity that kept hands busy, minds engaged, and the household supplied with everything it needed. But there was one aspect of Viking winter life that we have not yet explored, one that was perhaps the most intimate and essential of all: the care of animals. You lie on your bench in the darkness of early morning. The fire has burned low, just a bed of pulsing embers in the central hearth, and the longhouse is filled with the sounds of sleep, the slow breathing of your family members, the occasional mutter of someone dreaming, the soft rustling of the straw and fur bedding. And from the far end of the building, the warm, living sounds of the animals. A cow shifts her weight, a goat bleats softly, a horse stamps a hoof against the packed earth floor. These sounds are as familiar to you as your own heartbeat. They are the sounds of wealth, security and survival. The animals in the byre end of your longhouse are not pets. They are not exactly livestock in the modern industrial sense either. They occupy a middle ground, valued individuals whose welfare directly affects the welfare of the entire household. During winter, caring for these animals is one of the most important daily tasks. Every morning, before the humans eat, the animals must be fed and watered. The hay that was so carefully gathered and stored during summer is brought out in measured portions. Each animal receives its allotment, enough to maintain health and body weight, but not so much that the supply runs out before spring. Managing the hay supply was a constant source of anxiety. A particularly long or harsh winter could exhaust the reserves, forcing desperate measures. There are accounts in the sagas of Norse farmers stripping the bark from trees and feeding it to their cattle to keep them alive until the grass returned. Water for the animals was obtained by melting snow or breaking ice from nearby streams. In the depths of winter, when everything was frozen solid, this was laborious work. Snow had to be carried inside in buckets and melted by the fire, then allowed to cool to a drinkable temperature before being carried to the byre. A large household with a dozen or more animals might need to melt hundreds of litres of snow per day. The cattle were particularly important. A good milk cow was one of the most valuable possessions a Norse family could own. During the summer months, a cow might produce several litres of milk per day, which was processed into butter, cheese and skyr. During winter, milk production dropped dramatically due to the reduced daylight and limited feed, but it did not stop entirely. Even a small amount of fresh milk during the winter months was enormously valuable, both nutritionally and psychologically. There is something deeply comforting about warm milk on a cold morning. Sheep were valued for their wool as much as for their meat and milk. Norse sheep were a hardy breed, smaller and shaggier than modern sheep, with a double coat of coarse outer wool and fine inner wool. The outer wool was used for outerwear and sails, the inner wool for softer garments worn against the skin. During winter, the sheep in the byre required less feed than cattle but needed to be kept dry, as damp wool could lead to skin diseases and death. Goats were the hardiest of the domestic animals, capable of thriving on feed that would barely sustain a sheep. They produced small quantities of rich, nutritious milk and provided meat, leather and horn. Goats also had a reputation for being opinionated, destructive and difficult to manage, qualities that the Norse clearly respected, given that Thor's chariot was pulled by goats. Horses held a special place in Norse culture that went beyond their practical value as transportation and farm power. The Norse horse was a sturdy small breed, the ancestor of the modern Icelandic horse, capable of surviving harsh conditions with minimal care. But horses were also prestigious animals, associated with gods, heroes, and nobility. Horse fights, in which two stallions were goaded into combat, were a popular form of entertainment and gambling, and the sagas record numerous disputes that arose from the results of horse fights. Here is a quirky detail. The Norse had an extremely close relationship with their dogs. Viking-age dog burials, in which dogs were interred alongside their human masters, have been found at sites across Scandinavia. The Gokstad burial contained the remains of 6 dogs, suggesting that the deceased's pack was sent to accompany him in the afterlife. During winter, dogs served as watchdogs, hunting companions, and one suspects as particularly warm bedmates. Cats were also kept, primarily for rodent control. The grain stores that kept the household alive during winter were a magnet for mice and rats, and a good mouser was a valued member of the household. In Norse mythology, the goddess Freya's chariot was drawn by 2 large cats, lending a divine sanction to the practical business of pest control. The daily round of animal care gave structure to the winter days: wake, Feed the animals, feed yourself, work. Check the animals at midday, work more. Feed the animals again in the evening. Eat your evening meal, listen to stories, sleep, repeat. The animals were a constant responsibility, a living clock that divided the featureless darkness into manageable segments, and they were a source of warmth in more ways than one. On the coldest nights, when the wind screamed across the frozen landscape and the hearth could not quite hold back the chill, the body heat of a dozen cattle at the far end of the longhouse was a genuine comfort. You lay on your bench, wrapped in furs and wool, and you could feel the faint warmth drifting down the hall from the byre, a reminder that you are not alone in the darkness. Before we discuss the dangers of illness, let us take a detour into something unexpectedly civilized about Viking winter life. Let's talk about bathing. The popular image of the Viking as a filthy, unkempt barbarian is one of the most persistent and least accurate stereotypes in historical memory. In reality, the Norse were, by the standards of their age, remarkably clean. The English monk John of Wallingford, writing in the 13th century about the earlier Danish invasions of England, complained bitterly that the Danes were too fond of bathing and combing their hair, and that their cleanliness made them irresistible to English women. It is perhaps the only time in history that an entire nation has been criticised for being too attractive due to excessive personal hygiene. The Norse bathed at least once a week, typically on Saturdays. In fact, the Old Norse word for Saturday, laugardagur, literally means washing day or bathing day. This weekly bathing routine was maintained throughout the year, including during winter, which is impressive when you consider the logistics involved. Bathing in the Viking Age took several forms. The simplest was a wash with heated water in the longhouse, using a basin and cloth. But many Norse communities also had dedicated bathhouses, small, separate buildings that functioned similarly to the Finnish sauna, which is itself a Nordic tradition with roots stretching back thousands of years. The Viking bathhouse was a small, enclosed structure heated by a fire or by pouring water over hot stones. The bather would sit or lie in the hot steam-filled room, sweating out the dirt and grime of the week. The process was social as well as hygienic. People bathed together, and the bathhouse was a place for relaxed conversation and gossip. After sweating, bathers might scrub themselves with rough cloths or birch twigs, then plunge into cold water or roll in snow. The alternation between hot and cold was believed to be invigorating and healthful, a belief that modern medicine partially supports, as the practice does stimulate circulation and the immune system. In winter, the bathhouse served an additional psychological function. The intense, enveloping warmth of the steam was a profound contrast to the bitter cold outside, and the experience must have been deeply pleasurable. For a few minutes you could forget the darkness and the wind and the frozen landscape and simply luxuriate in warmth. It was a small luxury, but in a life defined by hardship, small luxuries mattered enormously. The Norse also took care of their hair and grooming. Combs, as we have mentioned, are among the most common finds at Viking archaeological sites, and they were used daily. Both men and women wore their hair long, and maintaining it required regular combing to remove tangles and lice. Men groomed their beards with the same attention. The Arab traveller Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, visiting the Danish trading town of Hedeby in the 10th century, noted that both men and women used a kind of eye cosmetic, possibly kohl, that enhanced their appearance. Clothing was also cleaned during winter, though not as frequently as bodies. Wool garments were brushed and aired, and linen undergarments were washed in heated water. The longhouse environment, with its constant smoke, meant that clothes accumulated a smoky smell that never entirely came out, but it was considered better than the alternative. Clean clothes, like a clean body, were a mark of self-respect and social status. Here is a quirky detail that archaeologists find endlessly fascinating. At several Viking sites, tiny metal ear spoons and tweezers have been found, small grooming tools that were carried on a chain attached to the wearer's brooch. These personal grooming kits, which also sometimes included small knives and nail cleaners, suggest that the Norse practiced a level of personal care that would not be out of place in a modern bathroom. The image of a Viking warrior pausing to clean his ears with a tiny silver spoon is not the most heroic picture, but it is an accurate one. The maintenance of personal hygiene during winter was not merely vanity. In a confined living space where disease could spread rapidly, cleanliness was a genuine survival strategy. The weekly bath, the regular changes of linen, the grooming routines, all helped to reduce the burden of parasites and pathogens that thrived in close quarters. The Norse may not have understood germ theory, but they had figured out through centuries of experience that clean people in clean clothes tended to stay healthier than dirty people in dirty clothes. The bathhouse, the comb, the weekly wash, these were not footnotes to Viking life. They were essential features of a culture that understood, perhaps instinctively, that surviving winter required caring for the body as well as the belly. Physical comfort, even in small doses, was a weapon against the despair and lethargy that the darkness could bring. A hot bath on a Saturday evening, followed by clean clothes and a good meal, was a way of asserting control over your circumstances, of reminding yourself that you were a civilized person living a deliberate life, not an animal merely enduring. And so the winter continued, each week marked by its Saturday bath, each day marked by its routines of work and rest, each evening marked by its stories and songs. The darkness pressed in, but the household held. The fire burned, the loom clacked, the smith's hammer rang, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the days began to lengthen. But before we reach the light, we must pass through the shadow of the greatest winter danger of all. Let us talk about health. Because in a Viking winter, illness was not just a misery, it was a mortal threat. You are, let us say, 3 months into winter. It is now late January or early February by our reckoning. The Yule celebrations are a fading memory, and the brief burst of light and warmth they provided has given way to the grinding reality of deep winter. The food stores are diminishing. The hay supply for the animals is a constant worry, and in the close, smoky confines of the longhouse, illness has arrived. Someone is coughing. It started a few days ago, a dry, persistent cough that worsens at night. Now others have picked it up. In the cramped quarters of the longhouse, where 15 or 20 people live, eat, sleep and work, in a space roughly the size of a modern 2-bedroom apartment, respiratory illness spreads like fire through dry grass. The smoky air does not help. The central hearth produces a constant haze that irritates the lungs and eyes, and modern analysis of skeletal remains from Viking-age sites has revealed a high incidence of sinusitis and other respiratory conditions, almost certainly caused by years of breathing wood smoke. But the Norse were not helpless in the face of illness. They had a sophisticated, if by modern standards incomplete, understanding of medicine and healing. The primary healers in Norse society were women, known as vuelvas or side konas, who combined practical herbal knowledge with spiritual practices. Their methods were a mixture of the genuinely effective and the purely symbolic, but the genuinely effective part should not be underestimated. Viking-age Scandinavians had access to a wide pharmacopoeia of medicinal plants. Yarrow, known as the warrior's herb, was used to staunch bleeding and treat wounds, applications that modern science has confirmed are effective, as yarrow contains compounds with anti-inflammatory and hemostatic properties. Chamomile was used for digestive complaints and as a mild sedative. Elderberry was used to treat coughs and colds. Birchbark tea was used as a general tonic and fever reducer. Honey, which has genuine antibacterial properties, was used both as a wound dressing and as a soothing agent for sore throats. The Norse also used more dramatic interventions. There are accounts in the sagas of wounds being stitched closed with needle and sinew, broken bones being set with splints, and even rudimentary surgical procedures being performed. One famous account from the saga of Olaf Haraldsson describes a healer feeding a patient a strong-smelling broth of onions and herbs, then sniffing the wound. If the smell of onions came through the wound, it meant the gut had been perforated, and the wound was considered fatal. It is a rough and ready diagnostic technique, but the underlying logic is sound. Historians still argue about the overall effectiveness of Viking medicine. Certainly the Norse had no understanding of germ theory, no antibiotics, and no way to treat many conditions that modern medicine handles routinely. Infections, complications from childbirth, appendicitis, and a host of other conditions were often fatal. Average life expectancy during the Viking Age was probably around 35 to 40 years, though this figure is heavily skewed by high infant and childhood mortality. A person who survived childhood could reasonably expect to live into their 50s or 60s. What the Norse did understand was the importance of cleanliness, at least by medieval standards. They bathed weekly, washed their hands before meals, and maintained their clothing and bedding in reasonable condition. The Arabic traveller Ibn Fadlan, who encountered a group of Rus, Vikings along the Volga River in the 10th century, described them as both the filthiest and the most hygiene-conscious people he had ever met, a paradox that suggests the Norse took personal grooming seriously, even if their overall living conditions were less than sterile. During winter illnesses, the sick person was typically kept near the fire, wrapped in extra furs and blankets, and fed warm broths and herbal teas. The rest of the household continued their routines, but with an added layer of watchfulness. In a world without hospitals, professional doctors, or any real understanding of how diseases spread, community care was the only option. You nursed your sick family members and hoped for the best, and sometimes the best did not happen. Death in winter was not uncommon, particularly among the very young and the very old. A Viking funeral in midwinter was a sombre affair, complicated by the frozen ground. In some regions, the dead were stored in outbuildings until the ground thawed enough for burial. In others, funeral pyres were used, the fierce heat of the fire cutting through the cold and sending the spirit of the deceased skyward with the smoke. But let us not dwell on death tonight. Let us instead talk about something that brought warmth and cheer to even the darkest winter nights. Let us talk about mead. Mead. The word itself sounds warm, like something golden and glowing, and that is exactly what it was. Mead is perhaps the oldest alcoholic beverage in human history, predating wine and beer by thousands of years. It is made, in its simplest form, by fermenting honey and water. The process is astonishingly straightforward. You dissolve honey in warm water, add yeast, either deliberately or by allowing wild yeast to colonize the mixture, and wait. The yeast converts the sugars in the honey into alcohol and carbon dioxide, and after several weeks to several months of fermentation, you have mead. The Norse loved mead with a passion that bordered on reverence. In their mythology, mead was quite literally the drink of the gods. The most famous myth about mead concerns the mead of poetry, a magical brew created from the blood of Kvasir, the wisest being in the cosmos. According to the story as told by Snorri Sturluson in the Prose Edda, Kvasir was created by the gods from the combined saliva of the Aesir and the Vanir, the two families of gods, as a symbol of their peace treaty. Kvasir wandered the world answering questions, but was murdered by two dwarves who mixed his blood with honey to create a mead that bestowed the gift of poetry and wisdom on anyone who drank it. The mead eventually came into the possession of a giant named Suttungr, who stored it in 3 great vats inside a mountain. Odin, ever hungry for knowledge and power, infiltrated the mountain through a combination of deception, shape-shifting, and seduction, drank all the mead, transformed himself into an eagle, and flew back to Asgard, regurgitating the mead into waiting vessels. This is why, according to the myth, poets are said to drink from Odin's gift, and bad poets are said to have received only the drops that fell from the wrong end of the eagle during his flight. In practical terms, mead was a luxury drink in the Viking world, more expensive and less common than ale or beer because honey was relatively scarce. Bees were kept by some Norse households, using simple straw hives called skeps, but the Scandinavian climate limited honey production. Much of the honey used for mead making was probably obtained through trade or wild foraging. As a result, mead was typically reserved for special occasions, feasts, and the halls of the wealthy. The everyday drink was ale, brewed from barley and flavoured with a variety of bittering agents. Before hops became widely used in Scandinavia, which happened gradually over the course of the Viking Age, the Norse flavoured their ale with a mixture of herbs called grut. Common grut ingredients included sweet gale, yarrow, juniper berries, and various other aromatic plants. The resulting brew was quite different from modern beer, less bitter, more herbal, and with a wider range of flavours. Brewing was typically women's work, one of the many responsibilities of the lady of the household. The process began with malting, soaking barley grains in water until they began to sprout, then drying them to halt the germination. The malted grain was then crushed and mixed with hot water to extract the sugars, a process called mashing. The sweet liquid was drained off, flavoured with grut and allowed to ferment. The whole process took about a week, and a busy household might brew a new batch every week or two during winter. The Vikings drank from a variety of vessels. The iconic drinking horn, made from the horn of a cow or aurochs, was real but probably reserved for formal occasions and toasting. Everyday drinking was done from wooden cups, ceramic vessels, or, for the wealthy, imported glass beakers. The act of drinking was highly ritualized. At feasts, specific toasting protocols were observed. The first toast was to Odin for victory and power. The second was to Njord and Freyr for peace and a good harvest. Further toasts were made to the memory of deceased relatives. To refuse to drink when a toast was proposed was a serious breach of etiquette. Here is a quirky tidbit that historians love. The Norse word for feast, vesla, literally means provisions or sustenance, reflecting the practical reality that feasting was not just about pleasure. It was about nutrition, about consuming the rich, calorie-dense foods and drinks that help sustain the body through winter. A well-attended Yule feast, where the host provided food and drink to dozens of guests over several days, was an enormous investment of resources, but it was also a form of social insurance. The guests would be expected to reciprocate, and the network of mutual feasting obligations helped ensure that no single household bore the full burden of winter alone. As you sit on your bench sipping ale from a wooden cup, the warmth of the drink spreading through your chest, you can appreciate the genius of this system. The Vikings had turned eating and drinking into a social technology, a way of binding communities together and distributing resources through the lean months. It was not charity, it was obligation, pride, and practical wisdom, all mixed together like the herbs in a cup of Groot ale. The evening deepens, the ale flows, the conversation grows softer, more contemplative. Someone begins to play a simple melody on a bone flute, a breathy, haunting sound that seems to come from a great distance. The music blends with the crackling fire and the murmur of voices, and you feel the particular kind of peace that comes from being warm and fed and surrounded by your people in a world of cold and darkness. This is the heart of Viking winter, not the raids, not the conquests, not the blood and iron of the sagas. Just this, a fire, a song, a cup of something warm, and the knowledge that you are not alone. The weeks pass, you have lost count of exactly how many, because in the perpetual darkness time becomes elastic. Days blur into nights and nights into days, distinguished only by the rhythm of meals and tasks. But your body has developed its own winter clock, attuned to the rise and fall of the longhouse routine, and you know, in the way that all northern people know, that you're past the halfway point. It is February now, or rather the Old Norse month called Thori, named perhaps for the frost giant Thori, or simply for the cold itself. This is traditionally considered the harshest period of the Scandinavian winter. The cold is at its most intense. The snow is at its deepest. The food stores are noticeably diminished, and the psychological weight of months of darkness is pressing down on everyone. This is the time when winter madness can set in. The Norse did not have a clinical term for what we now call seasonal affective disorder or cabin fever, but they recognized the phenomenon clearly enough. The sagas describe people becoming irritable, withdrawn, or prone to irrational behavior during deep winter. Quarrels that would have been trivial in summer could escalate into serious feuds when people had been confined together for months. There are accounts of outright violence erupting over minor provocations, a spilled bowl of porridge, a careless word, a disputed seat near the fire. The head of the household had to manage these tensions carefully. In Norse law and custom, the male head of household, the bonde, had both authority over and responsibility for everyone under his roof. This included family members, hired labourers, thralls, which is the Norse word for enslaved people, and any guests who might be staying. Keeping the peace in a crowded longhouse during the darkest months of winter was a genuine leadership challenge, requiring a combination of firmness, fairness, and occasional strategic distribution of mead. But the darkness also had its own strange gifts. The long nights fostered a kind of intimacy that was impossible during the busy summer months. Families talked more during winter, shared more stories, spent more time simply being together. Children grew closer to grandparents who had time to teach them. Couples who spent summer months working separately on different tasks found themselves side by side during the dark evenings, sharing a bench and a blanket by the fire. Historians have noted that birth records from later Scandinavian history show a pronounced spike in births during October and November, suggesting that February was a particularly productive month for Viking couples. There is a tenderness in the sagas that is easy to miss if you're looking only for the dramatic sword fights and sea voyages, brief, quiet moments of domestic affection that pierce the narrative like shafts of light. A man returning home after a long journey and finding his wife waiting by the fire. A mother singing a lullaby that had been sung by her mother before her. An old warrior sitting with his grandchild, carving a small wooden horse and telling stories of his youth. These moments are the real texture of Viking life, and they happened most often in winter. Meanwhile, the world outside the longhouse continued its own rhythms. The northern lights, the aurora borealis, were a frequent presence in the winter sky above Scandinavia, and the Norse had their own explanations for this phenomenon. Some believed the lights were reflections of the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge connecting Midgard, the world of humans, to Asgard, the realm of the gods. Others believed they were the glinting of light on the armour and weapons of the Valkyries, the supernatural warrior maidens who chose which fallen warriors would be carried to Valhalla. Still others saw them as the fires of Muspelheim, the the realm of fire that would one day consume the world at Ragnarok. Whatever their explanation, the Northern Lights must have been an extraordinary sight for people whose winter world was otherwise defined by darkness. Imagine stepping outside the longhouse on a clear, cold night and seeing the sky ablaze with curtains of green, purple and white light, rippling and dancing across the stars. It would have been terrifying and beautiful in equal measure, a reminder that the cosmos was alive and active even during the frozen months of human hibernation. Here is a quirky detail. The Old Norse word for the aurora borealis was norderljos, meaning northern lights, which is essentially the same term we use today. Some scholars have suggested that the relative scarcity of references to the aurora in the sagas indicates that it was such a common sight for the Norse that it did not warrant special comment. It would be like a modern New Yorker failing to mention skyscrapers. Why would you remark on something that was always there? The stars themselves were important to the Norse, particularly for navigation. During winter, when the sky was clear, the constellations were brilliantly visible in the unpolluted Arctic darkness. The Norse had their own names for the constellations and used them as navigational aids. The pole star, which they called the nail star or the world nail, was crucial for determining direction. The constellation we call the Great Bear or Big Dipper was known to the Norse as Karlavagnen, Karl's Wagon, and its position in the sky indicated the time of night. Even during the depths of winter, when the sun had vanished entirely, the stars provided a celestial clock that gave structure to the endless darkness. Spring does not arrive suddenly in Scandinavia. It creeps in, timid and hesitant, like a wild animal approaching a campfire. The first sign is the light. In late January or early February, depending on your latitude, the sun makes its first appearance above the horizon after weeks of absence. It is not much. A thin sliver of pale gold, barely visible above the southern mountains, lasting perhaps a few minutes before retreating again. But it is enough. It is a promise. The Norse called the return of the sun Solvende, the sun turning, and it was greeted with a mixture of relief and cautious hope. Relief because the worst of the darkness was truly over. Caution because the hardest weeks of winter often lay ahead. February and March could bring the fiercest storms, the deepest cold snaps, and the greatest risk of food shortages. You were close to the end, but close to the end was also close to the breaking point. The hay supply was watched with increasing anxiety. By this time of year, the careful rationing of autumn and early winter was being tested. Every farmer knew the math. You started with a certain amount of hay. Your animals consumed a certain amount each day. The grass would not grow again until April or May. If the math did not work out, you had difficult choices to make. Some farmers resorted to feeding their animals seaweed, which livestock could eat in small quantities and which provided some nutrition. Others reduced their herds by slaughtering additional animals, losing future breeding potential to gain immediate food. The human food supply was also running low. The barrels of salted meat were noticeably lighter. The stockfish stacks had diminished. The grain bins were not as full as they had been. This was the season of thin porridge and careful portions, when the lady of the household exercised her most critical skill, the ability to stretch limited resources across the remaining weeks of winter. But the lengthening days brought renewed energy and purpose. More outdoor work became possible as the light returned. Wood could be gathered from the forest. Ice fishing on frozen lakes provided fresh food. Hunters ventured further afield, taking advantage of the returning light to track game. The ptarmigan, a white-feathered bird that lives in the mountains of Scandinavia, was a popular quarry during late winter, as its white plumage made it nearly invisible against the snow to human eyes, but conspicuous against brown tree trunks and rocks. The ships in the Naust received their final preparations. Hulls that had been repaired during the winter were inspected one last time. New tar was applied to seams, rigging was tested. Sails were unfolded, checked for damage, and mended where necessary. The anticipation of spring brought with it the anticipation of voyages, and the men of the household began to discuss plans for the coming sailing season. Would they trade? Would they raid? Would they explore? The possibilities were as wide as the sea itself. Here is an important historical detail about the rhythm of Viking expansion. The great era of Viking raiding and exploration, from roughly 793 to 1066 CE, was fundamentally shaped by the seasons. The raids happened in summer, when the seas were navigable and the long daylight hours allowed for travel and combat. But the raids were planned in winter, during those long, dark evenings by the fire. The strategies were debated, the alliances were forged, the oaths were sworn. Winter was not just the season of survival, it was the season of preparation. Every great Viking summer expedition began as a conversation in a winter longhouse. The women, too, were preparing for spring. The textiles that had been woven during winter were cut and sewn into garments. New sails were finished. Trade goods were assembled and inventoried. The household was being readied, like a ship being fitted out for a voyage, for the burst of activity that spring and summer would bring. And the children, who had spent the winter learning and playing in the confines of the longhouse, were eager to be outside. As the snow began to melt and the first patches of brown earth appeared on south-facing slopes, they scattered like freed birds, running, shouting, revelling in the space and light after months of confinement. It must have been a glorious feeling, that first real day of spring, when the air smelled of wet earth and new grass and the sun actually provided warmth on your face. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Spring is still some weeks away, and there are parts of the winter experience we have not yet explored. Let us talk about the spiritual dimension of Viking winter, not the dramatic mythology of Yule and Ragnarok, but the quieter, more personal spiritual practices that sustained the Norse through the dark months. The Norse were not a dogmatic people, at least not before Christianity arrived. Their religion was practical, local, and flexible. Different communities might emphasize different gods, different rituals, different beliefs, while still sharing a common mythological framework. There was no central authority, no church, no scripture. The gods were real, present, and actively involved in human affairs, but they were not distant, judgmental figures demanding obedience. They were more like powerful neighbours, beings you treated with respect and offered gifts to in the hope of receiving favours in return. During winter, the spiritual life of the household centred on the home itself. The longhouse was not just a shelter, it was a sacred space, particularly the hearth. The fire in the central hearth was symbolically linked to the cosmic fire at the centre of the world, the fire of Muspelheim that would one day bring about Ragnarok, but that, in the meantime, provided the warmth and light that sustained life. Letting the hearth fire go out was considered not just practically dangerous, but spiritually inauspicious, a break in the connection between the human household and the divine order. Small offerings were made to the household spirits, beings known as landvettir, land spirits, or tomt, the guardian spirits of the homestead. These offerings were typically simple: a bowl of porridge left by the hearth, a splash of ale poured onto the threshold, a bit of bread placed on a windowsill. The practice was so deeply ingrained in Scandinavian culture that it survived the conversion to Christianity and persists in modified form today. The Scandinavian tradition of leaving porridge out for the Christmas Nisse, a small gnome-like figure associated with the farmstead, is a direct descendant of Viking Age spirit offerings. The Vettir were not gods. They were lesser spirits, local beings tied to specific places, rocks, trees, streams, hills, and individual farmsteads. They could be helpful or harmful, depending on how they were treated. A farmer who maintained a good relationship with the Vettir of his land could expect healthy crops, productive livestock, and general good fortune. A farmer who offended the spirits risked drought, disease, and disaster. During winter, when the natural world seemed dead or dormant, maintaining this relationship was considered especially important. There was also the practice of cider, a form of Norse magic or divination that was practiced primarily by women, though there are accounts of male practitioners as well. Cider involved entering a trance state, often induced by chanting, drumming, or the use of certain herbs, and communicating with spirits to obtain information about the future. The most detailed account of a cider ceremony comes from the saga of Eric the Red, which describes a travelling seeress called Thorbjorg, who visited a community during a difficult winter to prophesy whether conditions would improve. According to the saga, Thorbjorg arrived wearing a cloak of black lambskin, calfskin boots, and gloves of catskin lined with white fur. She carried a staff set with brass and studded with precious stones. At the ceremony, she sat on a high platform stuffed with hen feathers and asked for someone to sing the Vardlokke, the spirit-summoning song. A young Christian woman reluctantly agreed to sing, and the beauty of her voice attracted so many spirits that Thorbjorg was able to prophesy that the current famine would end soon and that the community would survive. Historians still argue whether cider was genuine shamanism, influenced by contact with the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, or whether it was a homegrown Norse tradition with independent origins. The Sami had their own powerful shamanic traditions, centered on the use of drums and trance states, to communicate with the spirit world, and there was extensive contact between Norse and Sami communities throughout the Viking Age. It seems likely that both cultures influenced each other's spiritual practices. What is clear is that these spiritual practices served a critical psychological function during the winter months. The ability to consult a seeress and receive assurance that the winter would end, that the crops would grow, that the community would survive, must have been enormously comforting to people facing real uncertainty about their future. The rituals gave shape and meaning to the experience of winter, transforming mere endurance into something purposeful and sacred. There is one more winter activity that deserves our attention, and it is one that bridges the gap between the practical and the mystical. Let us talk about runes. The runic alphabet, known as the Futhark after its first 6 letters, was the writing system of the Norse world. It was not used for long texts, not for books or documents in the way that the Latin alphabet was used in the Christian South. Instead, runes were carved on stone, wood, bone, and metal, typically in short inscriptions that served practical, commemorative, or magical purposes. During the winter months, when the long evenings provided time for detailed work, the carving of runes was a valued skill. A man might spend his evenings carving a runic inscription on a new sword blade, invoking the protection of the gods. A woman might carve runes on a small piece of bone to serve as an amulet for a sick child. A chieftain might commission a runic inscription on a drinking horn to commemorate a significant event. The older runic alphabet, the Elder Futhark, had 24 characters. By the Viking Age, this had been simplified into the younger Futhark, which had only 16 characters. Each rune had a name and an associated meaning that went beyond its phonetic value. The rune Fehu, which represented the sound F, also meant cattle or wealth. The rune Thurisaz, representing the TH sound, meant giant or thorn. The rune Isa, representing I, meant ice, a concept that would have been particularly resonant during the winter months. Rune carving was considered a form of magic as well as a form of writing. The god Odin himself was said to have discovered the runes through an act of self-sacrifice, hanging from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, until the secrets of the runes were revealed to him. This myth elevated runic knowledge to a sacred art, and those who could read and write runes were regarded with a mixture of respect and wariness. Here is a fascinating archaeological detail. At the trading town of Bergen in western Norway, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of runic inscriptions on wooden sticks and other objects dating from the medieval period, just after the Viking Age. Many of these inscriptions are mundane, records of business transactions, name tags, and property markers. But some are personal messages, love letters, jokes, insults, and gossip that provide a vivid glimpse into the everyday uses of runic writing. One famous stick reads simply, "I love you, kiss me." Another contains what appears to be a merchant's complaint about a dishonest customer. These are not the grand, formal inscriptions of runestones. They are the casual scribbles of ordinary people, and they suggest that runic literacy was more widespread than was once believed. During winter evenings, the learning and practice of runes was part of the broader educational tradition of the longhouse. An older family member might teach a teenager the runes, scratching them into a piece of soft wood and explaining their names, sounds, and mystical associations. This was not formal schooling. It was more like an apprenticeship, with knowledge passed down through demonstration and practice. The Norse also used the winter months for the maintenance and transmission of legal knowledge. Viking society operated under a system of customary law, not written law but memorized law, preserved and recited by specialists known as law speakers. The most famous law speaker in Norse history was Thorgeir Thorkelson, who served as law speaker at the Icelandic Althing around the year 1000, and who famously decided that Iceland should adopt Christianity, reportedly after spending a day and night under a fur blanket, contemplating the decision. The memorization of legal codes was a winter activity. Young men who aspired to positions of legal authority spent their winters learning the laws by heart, reciting them to elders who corrected and refined their knowledge. In Iceland, the law speaker was required to recite the entire body of law over the course of 3 summers at the Althing, a feat of memory that required years of winter preparation. The intersection of runes, law, and storytelling in the winter longhouse created a rich intellectual environment that challenges the stereotype of the Vikings as nothing more than illiterate barbarians. They were, in fact, a deeply verbal culture, one that valued knowledge, memory, and eloquence, and that used the long winter months to cultivate these qualities in each new generation. Let us go deeper into the longhouse now. It is late in the evening, weeks after Yule, and the household is settling into the quiet part of the night. The fire has been banked to a low glow, conserving fuel while still providing enough warmth to keep the worst of the cold at bay. The oil lamps have been extinguished one by one until only a single soapstone lamp remains lit near the hearth, casting a small circle of golden light. You are lying on your bench, wrapped in a sheepskin that still smells faintly of lanolin and smoke. Above you, the roof beams are barely visible in the darkness, massive timbers that hold up the weight of turf and snow. You can hear the sounds of the household around you, the breathing of sleepers, the occasional rustle of someone turning over, the soft creak of the building's wooden frame contracting in the cold. Sleep in a Viking longhouse was not like sleep in a modern bedroom. There was no privacy. You slept in a communal space, surrounded by your family, your servants, your guests, and at the far end of the building, your livestock. The bench on which you lay was perhaps a metre wide, shared with your spouse, or if space was tight, with another family member. The bedding was a combination of straw, animal skins, and woolen blankets, layered for warmth. The Norse slept in their undergarments, a linen chemise for both men and women, sometimes supplemented by woolen socks and a sleeping cap. The air temperature in the longhouse at night, with the fire banked low, might drop to 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, which is cool but not dangerously cold when you are bundled in furs and wool. The key to staying warm was insulation, trapping your body heat beneath layers of material, and the Norse were expert at this. Here is an interesting detail about Viking sleep patterns. Several historians have suggested that the Norse, like many pre-industrial peoples, practiced segmented sleep. Rather than sleeping in one continuous block of 7 or 8 hours, they may have slept in 2 segments, a first sleep of 4 or 5 hours, followed by a period of wakefulness lasting an hour or 2, and then a second sleep until morning. During the wakeful period, people might tend the fire, check on the animals, talk quietly, or engage in the kind of unhurried intimacy that the privacy of darkness afforded. The evidence for segmented sleep in the Viking Age is indirect but suggestive. References in the sagas to activities that take place in the middle of the night, not emergency situations but routine tasks, are consistent with a culture that expected a period of wakefulness between 2 periods of sleep. The practice makes particular sense during Scandinavian winters, when the night is so long that sleeping continuously from sunset to sunrise would mean 12 to 16 hours in bed, far more than the body needs. The long nights also made this the season of dreams. The Norse took dreams seriously. Dreams were not random neural firings, but messages from the gods, the spirits, or the dreamer's own subconscious wisdom. The sagas are full of significant dreams, often prophetic, that foreshadow important events. In the saga of Burnt and Jarl, the protagonist has a series of dreams that warn him of the attack that will eventually destroy his household. In Grettir's saga, dreams serve as omens of both danger and opportunity. Dream interpretation was a recognized skill. Certain individuals were known for their ability to read dreams, and their opinions were sought and taken seriously. A troubling dream might lead someone to change their plans, avoid a particular journey, or make a propitiatory offering to the gods. A promising dream might encourage a bold venture. The connection between winter, darkness, dreaming, and the spirit world was a central feature of the Norse understanding of the season. Winter was not simply a physical challenge to be endured. It was a liminal time, a period when the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds grew thin. The darkness was not empty. It was full of presences, spirits, ancestors, gods, and the strange creatures that inhabited the margins of the Norse cosmos. Trolls were believed to be most active in winter, as were the Draugr, the restless dead who walked the earth in search of warmth and company. The warding runes carved into the doorframes of the longhouse were not merely decorative. They were protection against the things that moved in the dark. You pull your sheepskin closer and listen to the sounds of the night. The wind has risen, driving snow against the walls of the longhouse with a soft, relentless hiss. The timbers creak. The fire mutters. From the byre a cow lows softly, and in the spaces between sounds, in the deep silence of a winter night in the far north, you can almost believe that you're hearing something else, something ancient and vast and patient. The voice of the darkness itself whispering that it has been here far longer than you and will be here long after you're gone. But the fire still burns, the warmth still holds, and sleep when it comes is deep and dreamless. Morning arrives, or rather, the routine of morning arrives, because there is still no sun. Someone has stirred the fire back to life, and the longhouse is filling with the sounds and smells of the day beginning. Water is heating over the hearth. Children are being roused from their furs. The animals in the byre are calling for their breakfast, a chorus of bleating and lowing that serves as nature's alarm clock. You stretch, feeling the stiffness in your joints that comes from sleeping on a wooden bench in cold air. You're 42 years old, which in the Viking age makes you solidly middle-aged. Your body carries the marks of a life of physical labour, calloused hands, a bad knee from a fall several years ago, and a persistent ache in your lower back that worsens in cold weather. But you are alive and functional, which is more than can be said for many of your contemporaries. You wash your face and hands in a basin of water that someone has warmed by the fire. Personal hygiene, as we mentioned earlier, was more important to the Norse than popular culture often suggests. The Arabic traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Norse traders in Russia in the year 921, noted that they combed their hair daily, an observation that's supported by the enormous number of combs found at Viking archaeological sites. Combs, usually made from antler or bone, are among the most common Viking artefacts, and their ubiquity suggests a culture that cared about personal appearance. You dress for the day. Your inner layer is a linen chemise, reaching to the knees. Over this goes a woolen tunic, dyed a deep russet colour with plant-based dyes extracted from the bark of alder trees. A leather belt cinches the tunic at the waist, from which hang your knife in its sheath, a small pouch containing a fire steel and flint, and a carved bone comb. Your legs are wrapped in woolen leg wrappings, strips of cloth wound from ankle to knee and secured with leather ties. Your shoes are leather, made from a single piece of cowhide shaped around a wooden last, with the hair side turned inward for warmth and waterproofing. If you are going outside, which you will, because the animals need water and the woodpile needs replenishing, you add more layers. A thick woolen over-tunic perhaps lined with fur, a heavy cloak, fastened at the shoulder with a bronze or iron brooch, a woolen hat that covers your ears, mittens made by the nail-binding technique, dense and warm and practically indestructible. The total ensemble is surprisingly effective. Modern experiments with replica Viking clothing have shown that a properly dressed Norse person could comfortably work outdoors in temperatures well below freezing, as long as they kept moving. Here is a quirky detail about Viking clothing that always makes me smile. The Norse were far more colourful dressers than the drab, earth-toned image that popular culture often presents. Analysis of textile fragments from Viking sites has revealed a wide range of dyes and colours. Woad produced blues, madder produced reds, weld produced yellows. Combinations of dyes could create greens, purples and oranges. The wealthy wore garments dyed with imported luxury dyes, including kermes, a brilliant red derived from scale insects. Far from being a sea of brown and grey, a Viking household in their best clothes would have been a riot of colour. You step outside the longhouse and the cold slaps you across the face. The air is sharp enough to feel like it is cutting your lungs. Your breath erupts in great plumes of white vapour. The snow is knee-deep in places, though the path between the longhouse and the outbuildings has been trampled down to a firm, icy track. The sky above is the colour of old pewter, heavy with clouds, though along the southern horizon there is a faint, almost imperceptible lightning that suggests the sun is somewhere below the mountains, gathering its strength. You fetch water from the stream. It is mostly frozen, but there is a spot where the current runs fast enough to keep a narrow channel open, and you break the thin ice with an axe and fill 2 wooden buckets. The water is so cold it makes your teeth ache when you take a drink. You carry the buckets back to the byre and pour water into the stone troughs for the cattle. They drink eagerly, their warm breath rising in clouds around their broad, placid faces. The woodpile needs attention. You select logs from the stack against the wall of the longhouse, choosing a mix of birch for quick, hot flames and denser oak for long-lasting coals. You carry several armfuls inside and stack them near the hearth to dry. Wet wood burns poorly and produces excessive smoke, so keeping a supply of dry fuel near the fire is a daily task. These mundane chores, carrying water, fetching wood, feeding animals, are the unglamorous foundation of Viking winter survival. They are not the stuff of sagas. No skald ever composed an epic poem about hauling firewood. But without them, nothing else would be possible. The great feasts, the heroic tales, the elaborate crafts, the spiritual practices, all of it rested on the humble, repetitive labour of maintaining the basic conditions for life. As the weeks continue to pass and the light gradually, grudgingly returns, the longhouse begins to change its character. There is a shift in mood, subtle but unmistakable, as the household transitions from the deep introversion of midwinter to something more outward-looking and energetic. People talk more about the future, plans are made for the spring planting, discussions about trading voyages become more concrete, There is a lightness in the air that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with hope. The Norse mark this transition with the festival of Disting, held in late February or early March. Disting was a combination of religious observance, market fair, and political assembly. Communities that had been isolated throughout the winter came together to trade, to settle disputes, to negotiate marriages, and to conduct the business that had accumulated during the months of separation. It was the first major social event after Yule, and it was eagerly anticipated. The Disting market was an important economic event. Goods that had been produced during the winter, woven textiles, forged tools, carved wooden objects, were brought for trade. In return, households acquired things they lacked: salt, iron ore, luxury goods, and information. The exchange of news was almost as important as the exchange of goods. What had happened in other communities during the winter? Who had died? Who had been born? What rumours had travelled down the coast or across the mountains from Sweden and Denmark? Here is a fascinating historical detail. The Disting at Uppsala in Sweden, one of the most famous of these winter assemblies, was held at the great pagan temple that medieval chroniclers described as adorned with gold. Whether this description is accurate or exaggerated by later Christian writers is debated, but the importance of the Uppsala Disting is not. It was one of the primary political and religious gatherings in the Scandinavian world, and its timing, at the end of winter, underscores the importance of the seasonal transition in Norse culture. The return of light also meant the return of more active hunting and fishing. As the days lengthened, hunting parties ventured into the forests and mountains, pursuing elk, reindeer, and smaller game. The tracks of animals were more visible in the spring snow than in the deep midwinter drifts, and the returning daylight made it possible to range further from home. Fresh meat, after months of preserved food, was a welcome luxury, and a successful late winter hunt could make the difference between a comfortable spring and a hungry one. Fishing also intensified. The spring cod run, the great scree migration that brought millions of Arctic cod to the waters around the Lofoten Islands, was approaching. Fishermen began preparing their equipment, mending nets, sharpening hooks, and caulking boats. The spring fishery was the most important economic event of the year for coastal communities, and every fisherman wanted to be ready when the first schools of cod arrived. And the ships were almost ready. In the Nost, the winter's repair work was complete. The hulls gleamed with fresh tar. The rigging was taut and new. The sails, patched and re-waterproofed, were folded and ready to be hoisted. There was a particular excitement that came with the readying of ships, a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that the Norse must have felt every year as winter loosened its grip. The sea was freedom. The sea was opportunity. The sea was danger. And it was calling. Let us pause for a moment and consider the larger picture of what we have been describing. The Viking system of winter survival was not a collection of random techniques cobbled together by people muddling through. It was a coherent, integrated, and remarkably sophisticated system that addressed every aspect of human need: physical, social, psychological, and spiritual. Physically, the Norse solved the challenges of cold, darkness, and food scarcity through clever architecture, effective clothing, diversified food preservation, and the strategic management of livestock and fuel. Their longhouses were not just shelters, but complete life support systems, designed to maintain livable conditions for humans and animals through months of extreme cold and darkness. Socially, the winter months strengthened rather than weakened the bonds of community. The enforced proximity of longhouse living, combined with the rich traditions of storytelling, game-playing, and communal work, created a social fabric that was dense and resilient. The feasting traditions, the gift-giving obligations, and the winter assemblies ensured that no household was truly isolated, that resources and support flowed through networks of mutual obligation. Psychologically, the Norse addressed the challenge of prolonged darkness through a combination of purposeful activity, creative expression, and spiritual practice. Every member of the household had meaningful work to do. The arts of poetry, music, and storytelling provided intellectual stimulation and emotional release. The religious practices, from Yule celebrations to household spirit offerings, gave the experience of winter a framework of meaning that transformed mere survival into something purposeful. Historians still argue about how pleasant or unpleasant Viking winters actually were. Some emphasize the hardship, the cold, the crowding, the limited diet, the smoke, the disease. Others point to the richness of the cultural life, the warmth of the community bonds, and the effectiveness of the survival systems. The truth is almost certainly that both perspectives are valid. A Viking winter was hard, but it was not empty, and it was not without its rewards. The key insight, perhaps, is that the Norse did not try to fight winter. They did not rage against the dying of the light. They adapted to it. They built their entire culture around the rhythm of the seasons, allowing winter to shape their activities, their social structures, their art and their religion. They understood that darkness and cold were not enemies to be defeated, but conditions to be accommodated, and they accommodated them with remarkable grace. This adaptability was, in many ways, the secret of Viking success more broadly. The same people who survived the darkness of Scandinavian winters went on to settle in Iceland, Greenland, and briefly in North America, adapting their survival systems to new and even harsher environments. The same techniques of food preservation, community organization, and psychological resilience that sustained them at home enabled them to thrive abroad. The Viking winter longhouse was not just a building, it was a training ground for a culture of extraordinary resilience and adaptability. And now let us consider something remarkable. The Viking winter survival system was so effective, so resilient, that the Norse did not simply survive their winters in Scandinavia. They exported their system to some of the harshest environments on Earth. When Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland around 982 CE and sailed west to explore the massive island he would optimistically name Greenland, he brought with him not just settlers but an entire system of knowledge about how to endure extreme conditions. The Greenland colonies, established on the southwestern coast where conditions were marginally less terrible than elsewhere on the island, survived for nearly 500 years, from roughly 985 to around 1450 CE. That is half a millennium of people living and raising families and building communities on the edge of the habitable world, using techniques refined over countless Scandinavian winters. The Greenland Norse built longhouses. They kept cattle, sheep and goats. They preserved food by smoking and drying. They hunted seals, walrus and caribou. They gathered driftwood for fuel and traded walrus ivory, and polar bear skins for the European goods they could not produce themselves. Their existence was harsher than anything their relatives in Norway endured, with longer winters, shorter growing seasons, and far less contact with the outside world. But the fundamental system was the same. The longhouse at the centre, the carefully managed food stores, the communal social structure, the rich oral tradition that kept spirits alive during the months of darkness. The Icelandic settlers faced similar challenges. Iceland, settled primarily from Norway beginning around 870 CE, offered a harsh but not impossible environment for Norse-style farming and pastoralism. The winters were fierce, the volcanic landscape was unforgiving, and timber was scarce from the very beginning. But the Icelanders adapted. They built their longhouses from turf since wood was unavailable. They relied even more heavily on fish and sheep than their Norwegian relatives, and they developed what may have been the most sophisticated literary culture in medieval Europe, producing the great sagas, the Eddas, and a body of poetry that preserved the cultural heritage of the entire Norse world. Here is a detail that connects all of this back to the winter longhouse. The Icelandic sagas were composed and performed during winter. The Kvöldvaka, or evening wake, was a specific Icelandic tradition in which the household gathered together during the long winter evenings for communal activities including saga recitation, poetry composition, textile work, and the teaching of children. It was the direct descendant of the Norwegian longhouse evening, transplanted to a new setting and refined into one of the greatest literary traditions in European history. Historians still argue about why the Greenland colonies ultimately failed. Climate change, specifically the onset of the Little Ice Age in the 14th and 15th centuries, almost certainly played a role. As temperatures dropped and the growing season shortened even further, the Norse system of pastoralism became increasingly untenable. The sea ice expanded, cutting off the shipping routes that connected Greenland to Europe. The colony withered and eventually disappeared, its final years marked by increasing desperation and isolation. But the failure in Greenland should not obscure the extraordinary success of the broader Norse winter survival system. For centuries, the Norse thrived in environments that would have defeated less adaptable peoples. They did it through the same qualities we have been exploring all evening: preparation, skill, community, and an unshakable determination to endure. The last recorded communication from the Greenland colonies is a letter describing a wedding that took place at the church in Valsey in 1408. A wedding. Even at the end, even as their world was closing in around them, The Norse of Greenland were still celebrating, still forming families, still insisting on the rituals of community and hope. There is something heartbreaking and magnificent about that. A wedding at the edge of the world in the twilight of a civilization as the darkness closed in one final time. But for you, in your longhouse on the Norwegian coast, the darkness is not closing in. It is retreating. The light is coming back. And the story of your winter, unlike the story of Greenland, has a happy ending. Let us return to the longhouse one more time. It is March now, the Old Norse month of Einmanuda, the lone month or solitary month. The name is slightly misleading. It does not mean the month of loneliness, but rather the month when winter begins to stand alone, its grip weakening as spring approaches. The light has returned in earnest. The sun now clears the mountains, and hangs in the sky for several hours each day, casting long golden beams across the snow-covered landscape. The quality of this light is extraordinary, clear and sharp and intense, reflecting off the snow with a brilliance that makes your eyes water after months of darkness. The change in the household's mood is dramatic. People smile more, they move more quickly, conversations are louder and more animated. The children are wild with energy, tumbling over each other like puppies. Even the cattle in the byre seem more lively, perhaps sensing the approach of the season when they will be turned out to pasture again. But the experienced members of the household know that this is also a dangerous time. The food stores are at their lowest point. The hay for the animals is almost gone, and there is always the possibility of a late storm, a final blast of winter fury that can arrive without warning in March or even April, dumping snow and plunging temperatures just when you thought the worst was over. The Norse had a word for this late winter period of scarcity, skamdegi, the short days, though by now the days are actually getting longer. The term was used more loosely to describe the lean period at the end of winter, when resources were stretched thin, and the new season's abundance had not yet arrived. It was the hardest time in some ways because the end was so close, and yet not quite within reach. This is when the fishing became critical. Even before the great spring cod migration arrived, the Norse were fishing through the ice on frozen lakes, catching trout, char, and other freshwater species. Along the coast, they collected shellfish from the rocky shore, mussels, limpets, and periwinkles that provided small but welcome supplements to the dwindling food stores. Seaweed was gathered and dried. Seabirds were trapped. Every available source of food was exploited. The women of the household performed one more crucial task during these final weeks of winter. They inspected and inventoried the remaining food supplies, calculating precisely how many days of food remained and rationing accordingly. This was not casual arithmetic. It was a life-or-death calculation, and the lady of the household, the husfreyja, bore the primary responsibility for getting it right. A miscalculation could mean starvation. A correct calculation, combined with prudent rationing, could stretch the supplies until the first fresh foods of spring became available. Here is a quirky detail that speaks to the resilience and resourcefulness of the Norse. In years when the food supplies were dangerously low, some communities resorted to eating the inner bark of trees, particularly birch and pine. The inner bark, or cambium, is edible and contains some nutrients, including starch and certain vitamins. It tastes terrible and provides minimal calories, but it can keep a person alive when nothing else is available. The practice of eating tree bark during famine was recorded well into the historical period in Scandinavia, and it represents the absolute last resort of a people who were determined to survive at any cost. And survive they did. Year after year, century after century, the Norse outlasted their winters. They did it through preparation, through skill, through community, and through an almost inhuman determination to keep going when the cold and the darkness seemed endless. They did it because they had no choice, of course, but also because they had built a culture that made survival possible and even, in its own smoky, crowded, ale-soaked way, enjoyable. The ice is breaking on the fjord. You can hear it from inside the longhouse, a distant cracking and groaning that sounds like the earth itself is stirring from a long sleep. The breakup of the sea ice is one of the most dramatic events of the Scandinavian year, and it has been happening at roughly the same time every spring for as long as anyone can remember. You go outside to watch. The fjord, which has been a flat white plain for months, is now a mosaic of ice floes, shifting and grinding against each other in the rising swell. Dark channels of open water snake between the floes, widening hour by hour. Seabirds are returning, wheeling overhead with their sharp, plaintive cries. The sound of moving water, after months of frozen silence, is almost unbearably beautiful. The grass is beginning to show on the south-facing slopes, thin and pale but unmistakably green. Within a few weeks the hillsides will be covered with new growth, and the cattle, thin and restless after their long confinement, will be turned out to graze. The transformation from winter to spring in the far north happens with breathtaking speed. 1 week, the world is still locked in ice and snow. The next, there are wildflowers blooming on the hillsides and the air is filled with the buzzing of insects. The household is in a frenzy of activity. There is so much to do. The longhouse needs to be cleaned, really cleaned, after months of winter occupation. The accumulated grime, soot and organic debris of a long winter is shoveled out and replaced with fresh rushes and straw. The bedding is aired in the spring sunshine. The smoke-stained walls are scrubbed. It is a massive spring cleaning, the kind that the Norse took seriously because a clean house was not just more pleasant to live in, it was a symbol of proper household management. The fields need to be prepared for planting. As soon as the ground thaws enough to be worked, the men are out with their ploughs turning the dark, rich earth and preparing the seedbeds for barley, oats and rye. The growing season is so short in northern Norway that every day counts, and a late start to planting could mean a reduced harvest and a harder winter next year. The ships are launched. This is perhaps the most exciting moment of all. The longship is dragged from its Norse on rollers down the beach and into the water. It floats. The winter repairs hold. The hull is sound. The rigging is tight. The sail catches the spring breeze. There is a moment of pure exhilaration as the ship takes to the water after months ashore, a feeling of possibility and freedom that must have been intoxicating. The first voyage of the spring might be a short one, a trip along the coast to trade with neighbouring communities, or a fishing expedition to the offshore banks where the cod are running. But for some men, the spring launch marks the beginning of a longer journey, to the markets of Hedeby or Birka, to the court of a distant king, to the monasteries and towns of England and Ireland, or even further, to Iceland, to the Faroes, to the unknown waters of the Western Atlantic. You stand on the shore and watch the ship grow smaller against the horizon, its square sail a pale rectangle against the blue-grey sea. The world has opened up again. The long night is over. You survived. And that perhaps is the most important thing to take away from tonight's journey. You survived. Not you personally, of course, though in the way of these stories it feels personal. But the Viking communities of Scandinavia, those stubborn, resourceful, endlessly adaptable people, survived their winters year after year for centuries. They survived the darkness and the cold and the hunger and the confinement. They survived by working together, by planning ahead, by using every resource available to them, and by refusing to let the darkness define them. They built warm houses and filled them with firelight. They preserved food with skill and care. They wove cloth and forged iron and carved wood. They told stories that kept their spirits alive. They played games that kept their minds sharp. They celebrated in the darkest time of year, defying the cold with warmth and the darkness with light. They held their communities together through bonds of obligation and affection. And when the spring finally came, they were ready to seize its possibilities with both hands. There is something deeply comforting about that. Not because the Viking world was easy or idyllic. It was neither. But because it demonstrates a fundamental truth about human beings, that we are capable of enduring extraordinary hardship, that we can find meaning and even joy in the most difficult circumstances, and that the bonds of community can sustain us through any darkness. So as you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, and the sounds of the modern world fade around you, maybe think about that Viking longhouse. Think about the fire in the hearth, the low murmur of voices, the smell of wood smoke and wool. Think about the stories being told in the flickering light, the same stories that have been told for 1,000 years. Think about the animals breathing softly in the byre, the children sleeping under their sheepskins, the adults sitting quietly by the dying fire watching the embers glow and fade. The darkness outside is deep. The cold is real, but inside there is warmth. Inside there is light. Inside there are people who know your name, who will feed you when you're hungry and care for you when you're sick and remember you when you're gone. The fire settles, the embers pulse, the wind whispers against the turf walls, and you are safe, you are warm, you are home. The wheel of the year turns, as it has always turned, as it will always turn. The darkness reaches its deepest point and begins to retreat. The light comes back. It always comes back. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the wind carry you. Let the warmth of the fire hold you. Let the old stories fold around you like a woolen blanket, soft and warm and worn smooth by 1,000 years of telling. Sleep now. The long night is over, and the light is coming home. End of script. Sweet dreams.